Hey guys, tonight we dive headfirst into something we romantically like to imagine as castles, white horses, and happily ever after. But spoiler alert, medieval marriage was often more nightmare than fairy tale. Honestly, if you found yourself suddenly whisked back to the Middle Ages, marriage would be among the least glamorous adventures awaiting you. In fact, if your time travel itinerary involves wedding bells ringing sometime between 500 and 1500 AD, I hate to break it to you, but you probably won't survive this, or at least your romantic ideals certainly won't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're at it, drop a comment below and let me know what city you're in, and what time it is right now. I'd love to know which brave souls are joining me on this dark journey, back through marital misery. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first misconception about medieval marriage probably involves romance, roses, knights, and ladies sighing beneath moonlit balconies. But let's shatter that illusion right away. Marriage back then was first and foremost a strategic business decision. Forget Tinder, forget blind dates. Imagine your parents and possibly your feudal lords swiping left or right for you, based purely on land, status, and maybe a few cows. In medieval Europe, your marriage wasn't simply your own affair. It was a critical alliance connecting families, sealing peace treaties, or securing powerful trade networks. You could wake up one morning as a carefree youth and go to bed a reluctant pawn in your family's chess game. Marriages weren't about compatibility, mutual interests, or shared hobbies, unless you count mutual frustration as a hobby. Instead, your worth was meticulously calculated based on the lands, castles, troops, or livestock your union could consolidate. Romantic, right? Take, for example, the dowry system. If you thought modern weddings were pricey, imagine your parents haggling over your monetary value. A dowry, essentially a hefty payment your family makes to sweeten the marital deal, was standard practice. The more attractive the marriage prospect, the higher the dowry. If you had no money, you might find yourself married off to whoever was willing to settle for a pig and a couple barrels of ale. Glamorous stuff. The feudal system operated on relationships built from such practical unions, often brokered through tedious negotiation processes that could last years. If the negotiations collapsed, things could quickly turn nasty. Families could hold grudges for generations, and the ripple effects of a failed marriage negotiation might even spark regional conflict. Imagine a situation where your romantic rejection could literally trigger a miniature medieval war. Talk about pressure. One particularly quirky detail, though historians still debate how widely it was practiced, is the custom of the groom paying a bride price, or the family exchanging elaborate gifts. Sometimes this involved livestock or property, other times items of luxury like fine silk or jewels. In certain parts of medieval Europe, it wasn't unusual to see cows paraded through village squares as part of elaborate premarital rituals, seriously upping the ante on wedding theatrics. Interestingly enough, scholars today openly debate whether medieval marriages were universally devoid of affection. While we often assume the era was strictly anti-romantic, some historical documents, letters, poems, and rare personal accounts do suggest a deeper emotional layer occasionally existing beneath the grim pragmatism. Could some of these arranged unions blossom into genuine partnerships, maybe even something resembling love? The scholarly jury remains out. Either way, once that deal was sealed, backing out wasn't simple or pleasant. Refusing a marriage proposal negotiated by your family wasn't exactly like cancelling dinner plans. In fact, stepping away from such arrangements could result in social exile, economic ruin, or worse. Breaking an engagement wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. As we'll see, medieval marriages could start disastrously young. Teenagers, or even younger children, found themselves promised in marriages arranged long before they had any idea what marriage even entailed. Think Romeo and Juliet, except less romantic, younger, and without the comforting presence of Leonardo DiCaprio or Claire Danes. And that's just the beginning. The Middle Ages held countless bizarre traditions, like the disturbing practice of wedding night witnesses. Yes, it's as weird and uncomfortable as it sounds. Or the hair-raising circumstances surrounding divorce, annulments, and remarrying. Love potions, scandalous clerical affairs, and medieval matchmaking were also part of this peculiar tapestry of matrimony. Before this night ends, you'll encounter medieval lovers who literally fought each other with swords, learn about royals who creatively sidestepped marital restrictions, and meet unlucky individuals forced into wedlock because of plague-induced desperation. Tonight's historical deep dive isn't about trashing medieval marriages for the fun of it, though there will certainly be some of that. It's about understanding the complex tapestry of cultural expectations, social obligations, and quirky traditions that shaped one of humanity's oldest institutions. So settle in, friends, because we're just getting started on this strange and unsettling journey through the intimate horrors and comedic absurdities of marriage in the Middle Ages. Trust me, you won't soon forget this rollercoaster ride through history. Good luck sleeping tonight. Since we've already touched briefly on dowries, let's dive deeper into this particular medieval headache. Picture yourself in a drafty, candlelit room, your entire extended family haggling loudly around a creaky wooden table. At stake, your marital future, reduced in essence to an intense bargaining session. Yes, welcome to the dowry debate. Today we think of weddings as ridiculously expensive ceremonies that drain your savings faster than you can say, destination wedding. But medieval marriage came with its own astronomical expenses, only instead of lavish floral arrangements or Instagrammable cake towers, people were negotiating literal cows, land, jewels, and sometimes cold, hard coin. The dowry system, in a nutshell, was the custom of a bride's family providing a substantial gift, usually money, land, or possessions, to the groom's family upon marriage. Essentially, the bride's worth was measured in currency or property, a charming notion that placed intense financial burdens on families with daughters. Imagine your parents constantly stressing about how many goats or gold pieces your existence was going to cost them. And dowry disputes weren't just financial annoyances, they could escalate into genuine drama. Medieval Europe was littered with court cases and family feuds born directly from dowry disagreements. Imagine awkward Thanksgiving dinners, but with swords and occasional duels instead of passive-aggressive remarks about burnt turkey. In fact, some families went to extraordinary lengths to avoid paying promised dowries, even faking illnesses, staging robberies, or conveniently losing their fortunes just before the wedding date. Who knew medieval fraud was so creative? Speaking of fringe absurdity, consider the bizarre variations across Europe. In some areas, dowries might include livestock. Imagine sheep and cows proudly march through your local village square, decorated with ribbons, flowers, and bells as a visual testament to your family's wealth. In other regions, especially wealthier city-states like Renaissance Florence, dowries often involved impressive financial arrangements, meticulously recorded by lawyers. The complexity of these negotiations could rival a modern corporate merger. Forget prenuptial agreements. These medieval documents made clear exactly how much land, money, jewels, and linens would change hands. Yes, even linens made the cut. And here's where things got particularly awkward. Dowries sometimes overshadowed even the bride herself. Historical records reveal embarrassing disputes where prospective husbands walked away from negotiations because a dowry was deemed insufficient. Imagine someone backing out because your dad wouldn't throw in that extra horse or a few more silver cups. Talk about insult to injury. Conversely, a sufficiently generous dowry could significantly enhance a woman's desirability, regardless of her personal attributes or affections. No pressure though, right? One historical case worth noting involved Margaret of Austria, a prominent 15th century noblewoman whose famously hefty dowry and related negotiations shaped European politics, alliances, and wars for decades. Margaret was repeatedly betrothed, often as a pawn in broader political games. The joke at the time, although probably not that funny to Margaret, was that every new engagement meant another round of tense, complex financial bargaining. You thought your wedding planning was exhausting. Try repeatedly negotiating your dowry and potential alliances across multiple European kingdoms. Yikes. But amid all this amusing absurdity lies an intriguing scholarly debate. Did dowries fundamentally empower or disadvantage women in medieval Europe? Some historians argue dowries allowed women greater economic security and independence within marriage, providing them leverage or a cushion if their husband turned out to be a disappointment, or worse. Others claim the dowry tradition fundamentally commodified and dehumanized brides, reinforcing women's status as property and economic burdens. It's a nuanced historical argument, with evidence pointing both ways. There were certainly examples of women benefiting financially from their dowries, using them as insurance in case of widowhood or abandonment. Conversely, other examples show women trapped in miserable circumstances precisely because their dowries weren't generous enough, leaving them vulnerable and powerless within their marriages. So the dowry, weirdly enough, represents one of those fascinating historical paradoxes, a practice simultaneously offering women both potential power and cruel vulnerability. Welcome to the medieval marriage landscape, where ambiguity and contradiction reign supreme. Still, if you had the bad luck of ending up as a bride-to-be with a modest dowry, or worse, none at all, you might face bleak marital prospects. Historical records grimly recount women forced into religious convents simply because their families couldn't afford suitable dowries, or others forced into marriages far beneath their social expectations. And here's a quirky side note to brighten, or possibly disturb, your evening. In some rural European communities, failing to deliver on dowry promises could trigger bizarre public shaming rituals. Offenders might face ridicule in community gatherings, public announcements mocking their stinginess, or even humiliating theatrical performances mocking their inability to produce the agreed-upon dowry. Picture your neighbours performing an embarrassing skit portraying your family as cheap or untrustworthy. Harsh. The cultural impact of the dowry system lingers surprisingly long. In fact, traces of this practice persist even today in various parts of the world, reminding us just how stubbornly medieval customs can cling to society, centuries after they stop making much sense. It's a testament to humanity's impressive ability to cling on to outdated traditions like sentimental pack rats. So, tonight, as you nestle beneath cosy blankets, spare a thought, or maybe a laugh, for those medieval brides and their dowry drama. Perhaps your own wedding plans seem a little less stressful now, or maybe they just seem like an echo of these strange ancient practices. Either way, medieval marriage has more unsettling surprises to reveal, so relax, get comfortable, and brace yourself as our strange and slightly terrifying bedtime story continues. If the concept of bargaining over dowries didn't already convince you medieval marriage was downright unsettling, let's dive into an aspect that's both obvious and controversial: consent. Today, we often idealise the notion that marriage should spring from two individuals mutually deciding to spend their lives together. How cute, right? But if you found yourself standing at a medieval altar, your personal enthusiasm for the person across from you wasn't exactly top priority. In fact, the issue of consent in medieval marriages was an intriguing paradox. Officially, medieval church teachings actually emphasised that marriages required consent from both partners. This is a historical fact often overlooked by popular narratives, which depict medieval marriages as universally forced arrangements. Yet, despite church declarations, practical realities often fell far short of the ideal. Official doctrine might speak of mutual agreement, but family obligations, economic pressures, and political alliances typically overrode any romantic or personal considerations. Imagine yourself there. Your parents or guardians have just informed you that next week you're marrying someone from 2 villages over, whose main qualifications are owns land and hasn't actively raided our sheep. Maybe you've met them briefly once or twice, or worse, never at all. Consent, while technically necessary, often translated into reluctant resignation rather than genuine enthusiasm. Picture yourself sighing deeply, muttering a resigned "I do," with all the excitement of someone agreeing to update software terms and conditions, because refusal might trigger family drama or scandal. Historical records vividly document numerous instances of reluctant or outright coerced unions, particularly among noble or royal households. One notorious case involved Margaret Beaufort, the mother of England's King Henry VII. Margaret was married off at the staggering age of just 12, becoming a mother by 13, a disturbing historical detail even by medieval standards. Historians still debate the nuances of her personal feelings about this union, but no doubt exists that Margaret had little say. Such cases highlight a sobering medieval reality. Consent was often reduced to a mere formality, or an afterthought. Yet medieval scholars didn't universally accept these forced circumstances silently. Interestingly, there was considerable intellectual debate about the ethics and morality surrounding consent in marriage. Theologians, clerics, and philosophers discussed at length whether a marriage arranged without true personal agreement was spiritually legitimate. In fact, church courts occasionally annulled marriages explicitly, because one partner convincingly argued they were coerced or tricked into the union. Think medieval divorce court drama. but with Latin chanting and intense theological arguments, rather than modern-day shouting matches over who gets the espresso machine. This scholarly debate introduces an odd medieval paradox. On one hand, the Church insisted upon free consent. On the other hand, parents, lords, and matchmakers regularly steamrolled right over those same teachings. It's as if medieval society collectively shrugged, admitting, consent would be nice, sure, but honestly, who's got the time? Sometimes young brides and grooms attempted to use these church teachings strategically, declaring they never consented, seeking annulments when marriages turned sour. Imagine medieval husbands and wives standing before dour church judges, dramatically claiming they were coerced or misled into marriage, appealing directly to religious teachings about free choice. Not all these appeals succeeded, but their very existence illustrates medieval people's surprising awareness of consent's ideal, even if practical realities often stomped all over it. A quirky fringe fact emerges in medieval literature, particularly romantic poetry. In these literary tales, especially those of courtly love, consent and mutual desire were portrayed as central, even sacred values, despite directly contradicting widespread social practices. Poems and stories depicted characters passionately choosing each other freely, emphasizing personal connection and mutual longing. Think of it as medieval wish fulfillment, literature providing an escape into fantasy where marriages were built on mutual adoration, rather than sheep counts or castle acreage. This literary paradox further highlights how medieval society wrestled deeply with consent. Even as families negotiated unions with financial and political pragmatism, their literature dreamed romantically of marriages born entirely of free choice. It's a fascinating cultural schizophrenia that kept medieval theologians, scholars and poets busy for centuries, each trying to reconcile idealistic teachings with pragmatic realities. And just for a moment, let's spare a quirky side glance toward another odd medieval twist, clandestine marriage. Because the Church acknowledged consent as essential, some couples cleverly exploited this loophole by secretly marrying each other without family knowledge or approval. Medieval chronicles occasionally recorded dramatic instances of young couples sneaking away to exchange vows quietly in private chapels, or even under cover of night. Imagine yourself sneaking into the village chapel by candlelight to exchange whispered vows with your true love, knowing full well the explosive family drama waiting the next day. It's daringly romantic in a scandalous medieval way, a medieval Romeo and Juliet scenario with less poetry and more grim realism. However, clandestine marriages were also risky. Families often retaliated harshly, disinheriting rebellious children, or even attempting to forcibly separate these bold, secretly wedded couples. Thus, the secret marriage route, while romanticized, frequently ended disastrously. So, while medieval religious doctrine officially demanded mutual consent, reality frequently involved uncomfortable compromises, coercion, or resigned acceptance. Consent, that fundamental concept we now take for granted, was thoroughly messy in medieval Europe, debated passionately, violated frequently, idealized poetically, and exploited cleverly. Tonight, as you snuggle down beneath your covers, safely distant from medieval marital pressures, ponder the irony that medieval consent debates echo intriguingly into modern conversations about relationships, autonomy, and choice. As we continue journeying deeper into medieval marriage territory, you'll discover still more unsettling traditions and unexpected insights. And trust me, we're just scratching the surface. So far, we've discussed how consent, dowries, and practical considerations governed medieval marriages. But let's take a moment to delve into one of the era's more troubling marital realities, marrying young. And when I say young, I mean alarmingly young. Picture your teenage self, braces and awkward haircuts included, suddenly being told it's time to tie the knot. If that doesn't make you shiver beneath your cozy blankets tonight, I don't know what will. It's a somewhat uncomfortable historical fact that marriageable age in medieval times often differed drastically from today's norms. Girls, in particular, frequently faced betrothals or marriages at astonishingly young ages, sometimes as early as 11 or 12. Boys, though typically older, weren't necessarily much more mature, with marriages often arranged in early adolescence. This wasn't a quirky medieval eccentricity. It was socially accepted and in many cases actively encouraged. Now, before you toss and turn tonight imagining medieval weddings filled with bewildered tweens dressed in oversized garments, Let's pause briefly to clarify a widespread misunderstanding. Marrying young didn't necessarily mean immediate cohabitation or consummation. Betrothals could remain purely symbolic for several years, especially among nobility, acting as placeholders until the young couple reached a slightly more acceptable age. But even acknowledging that nuance, medieval marital age still remains disturbingly young by modern standards. One well-known historical example, both fascinating and troubling, is the infamous case of Isabella of Valois, married off to King Richard II of England in 1396 at the incredibly tender age of 6. To modern ears, this sounds unquestionably horrific. To medieval contemporaries, however, this marriage represented a perfectly legitimate political arrangement, uniting royal houses, stabilising regional politics, and setting the stage for future alliances. Isabella lived in Richard's court, but thankfully their marriage wasn't immediately consummated, which was common practice for royal child marriages. Yet, even with that consideration, it's a situation deeply unsettling to contemporary sensibilities. And here we encounter a quirky medieval paradox. While early marriages were commonplace, the idea was not without its medieval critics. Scholarly debates occasionally erupted around the appropriate marital age. Clergy and medical writers argued about when young people were physically and morally capable of handling marriage's responsibilities. Some theologians strongly recommended waiting until at least 14 or 15, especially for girls, expressing concerns about physical health, moral development, and emotional readiness. Think medieval doctors shaking their heads solemnly, cautioning anxious parents that marrying their 12-year-old daughter too early might lead to complications or immorality. These debates illuminate a surprising medieval complexity. Society was both aware of the risks inherent in marrying too young, and yet often ignored these warnings for reasons of political expediency or economic practicality. If your family stood to gain power, lands, or stability through an early marriage, medical or moral arguments often faded into background noise. Interestingly, medieval law itself reflected this contradictory stance. Canon law set minimum ages, usually around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but families routinely bypassed these guidelines through special dispensations. Picture medieval parents petitioning priests and bishops for formal permission to marry off their children at younger than prescribed ages, negotiating complex theological and social hoops to justify these early unions. On a slightly less troubling and more amusing note, some medieval societies developed elaborate customs surrounding young betrothals, especially among the nobility. Ritualized ceremonies like formal engagement announcements, exchanging symbolic gifts, and elaborate public presentations marked these arrangements. Betrothed children might be ceremonially introduced as future spouses at elaborate banquets or feasts. Imagine the awkwardness of two nervous 13-year-olds forced to politely hold hands or exchange shy glances beneath the critical gaze of their extended families and assembled guests. You thought your prom night was awkward. There were also numerous humorous and sometimes tragic cases of medieval youth rebelling or resisting these early marriages. Chronicles occasionally recorded young brides or grooms actively fleeing their marital responsibilities, literally running away or stubbornly refusing to participate in ceremonies. Picture a young medieval bride escaping through a castle window, clambering down ivy-covered walls, dramatically avoiding marriage to a husband chosen entirely without her input. Not exactly the fairy tale castle story you imagined, is it? Yet more commonly, medieval children simply resigned themselves quietly to these marital arrangements, accepting them as the inevitable fate awaiting them. They grew up in a society so deeply accustomed to early marriage that most scarcely questioned the practice. Young brides and grooms received minimal, if any, preparation, certainly nothing resembling contemporary marriage counselling or educational programs. Medieval sex education, if it existed at all, was vague and awkwardly cryptic, leaving confused adolescents to figure things out mostly on their own. We'll dive deeper into this amusingly uncomfortable topic later tonight. The scholarly debate around medieval marital age remains quite active today. Historians continue debating exactly how common truly early marriages were among non-nobility, where records remain scarce. Were ordinary medieval peasants and townsfolk equally eager to marry off their young children? Or was this primarily an elite custom focused on consolidating power? Historical evidence suggests varied practices across different regions and classes. While noble families frequently utilised early betrothals strategically, ordinary folk might have been more practical. waiting longer until both partners could actively contribute economically to a household. Tonight, as you snuggle comfortably beneath your covers, safely distant from any forced medieval betrothals, spare a moment's reflection. Medieval marriage, as we've seen so far, existed as a fascinating, disturbing, paradox-filled mixture of strategic practicality and societal compromise, with youthful marriages highlighting these contradictions especially vividly. So brace yourself, friends. We're still only scratching the surface. Medieval marriage has even stranger and more disturbing customs, waiting for us in tonight's historical bedtime journey. Settle in, breathe deeply, and get ready as our exploration continues to unfold. Given everything we've covered so far, you might wonder, was there ever a medieval escape hatch from these strategically arranged marriages? Could you simply change your mind, call it off, and avoid a lifetime paired with someone whose primary attraction involved livestock count or land acreage? Well, let's dive into what breaking an engagement or marriage meant in medieval society. And trust me, it wasn't a casual, hey, let's see other people kind of moment. To be clear, medieval betrothals weren't mere casual promises, they were serious contractual obligations. Imagine signing a business agreement today, complete with witnesses, notaries, and possibly angry lawyers glaring at you. Breaking off these engagements could mean economic devastation, bitter family feuds, legal battles, or even violence. The social fabric of medieval communities depended heavily on keeping promises and honouring agreements, and marriages stood right at the core of this intricate web. And yet, despite these risks, medieval history offers plenty of colourful stories about men and women who desperately tried, and occasionally succeeded, in escaping arranged marriages. Picture yourself in their shoes, carefully plotting a daring escape from an unwanted union, sneaking quietly through castle corridors at midnight, dodging vigilant guards and watchful servants. Perhaps you disguised yourself in servant clothing, or fled quietly into the night on horseback. However romantic or dramatic, such stories usually ended less like romantic movie escapes and more like medieval nightmares. Fugitives swiftly recaptured, severely reprimanded, or socially ostracised. Here's one quirky historical detail. Sometimes the resistance to arranged marriages came from the parents themselves, often after realising they'd made a disastrously bad deal. Families might discover hidden scandals, financial insolvency, or unexpected rivalries threatening the alliance. Historical chronicles recount instances where families frantically tried renegotiating agreements or breaking off marriages, sometimes going so far as inventing illnesses, claiming divine visions, warning against the marriage, or accusing the other family of secret crimes. Imagine medieval parents dramatically feigning illness, or inventing visions from saints simply to avoid an embarrassing social misstep. Sounds exhausting, right? Church authorities added a further complicated layer. Officially, medieval religious doctrine insisted on the permanence and sanctity of marriage. Yet, the Church paradoxically recognised valid reasons for annulment, especially if either party was coerced, deceived, or forced against their will. Consequently, medieval Europe saw numerous church courts regularly sorting through marriage annulment cases filled with allegations of coercion, fraud, impotence, or even witchcraft. Picture medieval judges patiently listening to wild accusations, painstakingly examining the intricate details of troubled relationships, while trying not to roll their eyes at especially extravagant claims. A quirky and frankly odd twist in medieval marital law concerned impotence. Believe it or not, impotence was one of the few recognised grounds for annulment. Courts required physical proof or examinations, leading to some extraordinarily awkward courtroom moments. Imagine the cringe-inducing embarrassment of couples testifying publicly, or worse, undergoing humiliating medical examinations to prove or disprove claims of impotence. Not exactly the stuff romantic legends are made of, and yet annulments for impotence were a surprisingly common legal tactic, often exploited strategically. Medieval chronicles amusingly document husbands and wives conveniently accusing each other of impotence, sometimes after years of marriage, simply as an excuse to legally separate and remarry. Cynical? Sure. Clever? Absolutely. Aside from annulments, medieval courts might occasionally allow formal divorces or separations, but these cases were exceedingly rare, complicated, and controversial. Divorces required complex justifications and rarely resulted in remarriage rights. Couples granted separation often spent their lives entangled in ongoing legal battles over property and inheritance rights. think messy divorce dramas today, minus Netflix binges or ice cream comforts, replaced instead by stern monks, complicated Latin texts, and endless courtroom arguments. Historical chronicles reveal particularly scandalous cases of broken engagements leading to intense violence or vendettas between families. Consider a situation from medieval Italy, where family honour and revenge dominated social life. A broken engagement wasn't merely awkward, it was a brutal insult often triggering blood feuds or street violence. Imagine entire families feuding fiercely over one failed betrothal, rival gangs armed and glaring across narrow medieval streets, all sparked by one couple's failed union. Shakespeare would have a field day. Yet, despite these brutal risks, young medieval lovers occasionally found creative, humorous, and even daring ways to sabotage their arranged marriages. There are historical accounts of young people acting deliberately unhinged, publicly embarrassing themselves, or staging elaborate scandals just to scare off potential spouses. Picture a young medieval noblewoman openly pretending madness, or loudly claiming she had visions of spirits and demons, all calculated performances to convince the groom's family that the marriage would be a disastrous mistake. Medieval teenagers, it turns out, were impressively inventive when desperate. An intriguing scholarly debate continues around how prevalent these desperate resistance tactics really were among ordinary medieval people. Did everyday folks dramatically resist arranged marriages, or did these incidents primarily occur among the wealthy elite, whose political and financial stakes were much higher? The answer remains contested. Historians argue extensively, pointing to scarce documentation from lower social classes. Yet, occasional village or court records hint at similar struggles even among the common folk, suggesting medieval marriage drama might have touched everyone from peasants to princes. So, tonight, as you rest beneath your warm covers, grateful perhaps for your ability to swipe left or right without triggering family feuds or courtroom embarrassments, spare a thought, or maybe a sympathetic smile, for medieval individuals who braved tremendous social risks trying to escape unhappy marital unions. Whether cunningly inventing scandals, desperately fleeing under cover of darkness, or courageously petitioning skeptical courts, their stories vividly remind us just how difficult escaping an unwanted marriage once was, and still can be in parts of the world today. Brace yourself, friends. This journey into medieval marital madness still has many strange twists ahead. So relax, settle in, and prepare to uncover even more unsettling surprises awaiting us in tonight's historical exploration. Alright, if escaping marriages wasn't awkward enough, let's dive straight into one of medieval marriage's most bizarre traditions, wedding night witnesses. Yes, you heard that correctly. Picture yourself at your wedding reception, full of smiles and cake, only to have family members casually follow you right into the honeymoon suite to verify that the marriage was properly consummated. Sounds horrifying? Welcome to medieval wedding nights, where privacy was not only optional, it was positively discouraged. Now, if you're comfortably lying in bed listening to this, try to avoid visualizing that scenario too vividly, or you might find yourself staring at the ceiling a little longer than usual tonight. Medieval marriages, especially among the nobility, were considered incomplete until consummation was confirmed, often requiring physical proof. Why, you might wonder? Because consummation provided legal and religious legitimacy, proving the couple was genuinely married in the eyes of church and community. The stakes were high: inheritances, political alliances, and legitimacy of future heirs all hinged on this deeply uncomfortable moment. Here's how it typically unfolded. Following the wedding festivities, the newlyweds retired to their chamber, accompanied by an entourage of witnesses, close family, local clergy, sometimes even community leaders. Picture your Aunt Mildred, Uncle Bob, and the village priest cheerfully escorting you and your new spouse upstairs, perhaps dispensing awkward marital advice along the way. Once in the chamber, this embarrassing group would wait around to make sure the marriage was consummated, often lingering outside the door and sometimes, brace yourself, remaining inside the room itself. Medieval records occasionally describe witnesses chatting casually, drinking wine, and cracking jokes as the newlyweds tried desperately to perform their marital duty behind bed curtains or screens. Awkward doesn't even begin to describe it. But wait, it gets even stranger. In certain regions, particularly medieval France, this tradition had an official name: bedding ceremonies. Such events involved ritualized customs, songs, jokes, and celebrations as the couple was symbolically undressed and placed in bed by enthusiastic revelers. Imagine your medieval wedding night turned into a rowdy public spectacle, filled with laughter, teasing, and perhaps drunken singing by friends and family who clearly lacked a modern sense of boundaries or embarrassment. Historical records offer vividly humorous and cringeworthy descriptions of these ceremonies. Chronicles speak of newlywed couples blushing furiously as their guests made crude jokes, offered hilariously unhelpful marital advice, or sang bawdy songs about marital intimacy. It's like the worst possible wedding toast multiplied by 10 and stretched into an hour-long performance. Medieval humour clearly had little patience for delicate sensibilities. Now you might ask, did couples ever try escaping this mortifying tradition? Absolutely. Medieval documents mention instances of couples begging to skip this embarrassing ritual or deliberately hiding to avoid the crowd. Sometimes, wedding night witnesses had to actively search for reluctant couples attempting to sneak away unnoticed. Picture yourself and your spouse hiding anxiously behind barrels of ale or sacks of grain, desperately whispering escape strategies as a mob of laughing relatives prowled nearby. A charmingly bizarre way to begin married life, right? Yet, despite how absurd this practice appears today, it had genuine significance. The proof of consummation was essential in legal matters, especially regarding annulments or inheritance disputes. A marriage was vulnerable to challenge or annulment if consummation couldn't be confirmed. This meant witnesses weren't merely nosy or malicious, they were official, credible observers whose testimonies might later hold significant legal weight. And here we encounter a scholarly debate. Historians disagree sharply about how common or universal this practice was across medieval Europe. While documentation strongly supports its existence among the elite, scholars remain divided regarding its prevalence among ordinary people. Did peasants, farmers, or tradespeople routinely subject themselves to such embarrassments? Or was this primarily an aristocratic custom tied closely to inheritance issues and political alliances? The evidence remains tantalizingly ambiguous, leaving historians to debate the details. A quirky fringe fact about wedding night witnessing involves the detailed recording of consummation by clerical authorities. Clerics occasionally recorded highly specific notes about consummation in parish registers or court documents, such as confirmation from witnesses about the condition of bed linens or observations made about the couple's behaviour immediately afterward. Imagine your local parish priest solemnly noting in official records whether the marital bed had evidence confirming consummation. Awkward doesn't even begin to capture it. Another intriguing historical twist involves how some medieval communities creatively navigated around this embarrassing tradition. In certain places, especially smaller rural communities, couples were given symbolic privacy. Witnesses might briefly escort them into their bedroom and then quickly retreat, simply assuming consummation would naturally occur. Think of it as a medieval wink-wink, nudge-nudge scenario, providing couples a bit of mercy from embarrassment. Evidently, not all medieval villagers delighted in mortifying newlyweds, thankfully. But among the nobility, these customs were often rigorously enforced, and sometimes even weaponized politically. Rival families or political factions might deliberately dispute consummation claims, accusing a newlywed couple of failing to fulfill their marital duties. Such disputes could trigger humiliating public investigations or dramatic court proceedings. Imagine yourself dragged before a medieval court, forced to publicly defend the most intimate aspects of your marriage, while local townsfolk watched eagerly, enjoying the juicy scandal. Tonight, safely distant from medieval marriage embarrassments, spare a thought, and perhaps a nervous laugh, for those couples who endured this bizarre ritual. Medieval marriage, it turns out, wasn't merely about strategic alliances, dowries, or youthful betrothals. It was also about enduring some seriously awkward and intrusive traditions. As you lie snugly beneath your blankets tonight, perhaps feeling newly grateful for your own wedding night's privacy, or the simple ability to avoid marriage altogether, keep in mind that medieval marriage customs still have many more startling surprises waiting for you. Rest comfortably, friends, because our historical bedtime journey is only getting stranger from here. So if you thought the idea of having Aunt Mildred awkwardly hovering over your medieval honeymoon bed was bad, just wait. It gets worse. Tonight, let's step beyond awkwardness and dive headfirst into downright wild medieval marriage scenarios. Runaway brides and husbands literally put in chains, Picture yourself trapped in a medieval marriage so unpleasant that running away seems like a great option. Or worse, locked up by your spouse to keep you at home. Sounds like the plot of a weird medieval sitcom, right? Unfortunately, such unsettling events genuinely occurred. Let's start with runaway brides. Medieval history brims with fascinating, daring, and occasionally tragic stories of women escaping oppressive or simply unwanted marriages. Often, these escapes involve meticulous planning and ingenious disguises. Picture yourself quietly assembling peasant clothing, coins, and perhaps even weapons, slipping secretly out through castle gates disguised as a servant. Medieval chronicles vividly recount women fleeing in the dead of night, evading detection, and bravely taking refuge in monasteries, convents, or even neighbouring kingdoms. One especially famous medieval runaway bride was Christina of Markyate, an English noblewoman from the 12th century. Christina faced immense familial pressure to marry an influential nobleman, but she courageously defied her family, fleeing to hide secretly with religious hermits and monasteries. Her family, enraged and humiliated, hunted for her vigorously, even enlisting local knights and authorities. Yet Christina managed to evade them for years, eventually securing protection and recognition from sympathetic religious figures. Imagine yourself in her shoes, constantly moving between secret hiding spots, nervously glancing over your shoulder, constantly on the lookout for family agents determined to force you back into an unwanted marriage. Medieval life could be genuinely suspenseful. On the darker, stranger side of medieval marital dynamics were instances of husbands, and occasionally wives, taking extreme measures to enforce marital obligations, even resorting to physical imprisonment. Yes, medieval documents grimly record examples of spouses literally chained or locked away by their partners. It sounds like an exaggerated historical myth, but disturbingly, it occasionally happened. Some medieval husbands, paranoid about infidelity or simply oppressive in nature, took extraordinary steps to physically control their wives' movements. Picture a medieval manor house equipped with locks, barred windows, and even literal chains designed to ensure marital fidelity. Romantic, right? In fact, during the 14th century, legal records reveal troubling cases where courts prosecuted husbands who locked their wives away, seeking to enforce their version of marital obedience. Often, neighbours or concerned family members eventually intervened, rescuing the imprisoned spouse and taking the offending partner to court. Imagine the drama. Entire villages involved in heated court cases discussing precisely how long a spouse had been unjustly locked away or restrained by chains. If you think modern-day neighbour disputes about fence lines are intense, medieval marital imprisonment scandals would absolutely blow your mind. Here's an odd fringe fact. Sometimes it wasn't husbands chaining wives. Occasionally, wives themselves were accused of similar behaviour, restraining wayward or unfaithful husbands. Medieval records mention at least a few instances of women allegedly locking husbands in cellars or storage rooms, claiming it necessary to curb unruly or embarrassing behaviour. Picture medieval villagers shaking their heads sympathetically as they discussed the scandal of a local wife finally snapping and locking her husband away to prevent his drunken escapades or scandalous infidelities. These incidents, while rare, demonstrate medieval marriage's unsettling extremes. Such stories prompt intriguing scholarly debates today. How prevalent were these violent and oppressive marital situations across medieval society? Historians argue extensively over this uncomfortable question. While clear documentation of spousal imprisonment cases exists, scholars remain divided over their frequency and representativeness. Were these rare extremes sensationalized precisely because they were shocking exceptions, or did they indicate widespread marital oppression generally concealed beneath more benign official documents? Medieval historians continue wrestling with these uncomfortable questions, attempting to accurately interpret sparse and ambiguous historical records. The medieval church's role in these cases further complicates matters. Religious authorities consistently emphasize marital harmony, condemning excessive cruelty and advocating compassion between spouses. Clergy often intervened directly, mediating marital disputes, counselling troubled couples, and even sheltering individuals fleeing oppressive marriages. Imagine medieval monks or priests patiently listening to marital complaints, delicately negotiating peace between furious spouses, or discreetly assisting runaway brides and mistreated spouses. Yet, despite church mediation, severe marital oppression still occurred, often concealed within household walls. Marital violence remained a disturbingly common medieval problem, rarely documented unless it erupted into public scandal or legal action. Historical chronicles reveal tragic and poignant glimpses of individuals silently enduring terrible situations, often lacking community or family support to escape. But lest we spiral into grim despair, let's briefly consider a quirkier, humorous twist. Medieval literature and popular culture frequently mocked oppressive or controlling spouses. Satirical songs, comic plays, and humorous tales routinely ridiculed jealous husbands or domineering wives, portraying them as laughable characters deserving ridicule. Medieval humour occasionally provided cathartic social critique, gently nudging audiences to reconsider oppressive marital practices, all under the guise of entertainment. Tonight, as you lie comfortably beneath your cosy blankets, far removed from any medieval marital chains or daring midnight escapes, spare a thought for those medieval individuals whose marriages were genuinely terrifying ordeals. Whether bravely fleeing oppressive unions or enduring chains imposed by controlling spouses, their unsettling experiences remind us that medieval marriages involved far more complexity, drama, and danger than romantic fairy tales suggest. Our historical bedtime journey still has plenty of surprising twists ahead, so settle comfortably, take a calming breath, and prepare yourself for the next peculiar chapter in our medieval marriage saga. Sweet dreams, friends, though perhaps dreaming about castles and knights may seem slightly less appealing now. After escaping marriages, chains, and awkward wedding night rituals, you'd think medieval marriage couldn't get any stranger. But, of course, you'd be wrong. Let's shift our focus for a moment to a particularly intriguing figure of medieval marriage lore, the knight. Knights, with their shining armour and noble quests, seem romantic enough at first glance. Every Hollywood film portrays them dramatically galloping toward castles, rescuing damsels and pledging eternal devotion. But behind that polished armour and flowing banners lurked a far more complicated, often uncomfortable reality. Imagine you're a medieval knight, sworn by chivalric code to protect the weak, uphold honour, and importantly, demonstrate undying loyalty to your feudal lord. Yet you're also expected to marry for strategic political alliances or economic stability. Sounds straightforward enough, right? Except medieval chivalry also involved an idealised, almost obsessive concept known as courtly love. Intense, often unfulfilled romantic devotion directed toward another man's wife. Yes, you heard correctly, another man's wife. So here you are, a medieval knight, obligated. Simultaneously toward strategic marriages, unwavering feudal loyalty, and scandalous romantic longings. Awkward barely scratches the surface. Medieval knights regularly found themselves caught in this impossible juggling act. Historical chronicles vividly document cases where knights dutifully married according to their lord's wishes or family obligations, only to develop profound romantic attachments elsewhere, usually toward noble women already married to someone else. Picture yourself quietly suffering secret, unrequited love from a distance, discreetly composing poetic verses about unattainable women, all while forced to share polite smiles with spouses chosen solely for political reasons. Medieval marriage could seriously complicate a knight's love life. Take the legendary example of Sir Lancelot, a prominent figure in Arthurian legend. While entirely fictional, Lancelot's enduring fascination highlights medieval society's genuine anxieties around knights and their complicated emotional entanglements. Officially loyal to King Arthur, Lancelot famously falls desperately in love with Queen Guinevere, creating a disastrous romantic triangle. While purely legendary, this story encapsulates real medieval tensions, exploring anxieties surrounding love, honour, betrayal, and marital obligations. Medieval society clearly understood, and even feared, the emotional complications surrounding knights' romantic relationships. This intense cultural anxiety occasionally led medieval knights to truly baffling behaviours, with some resorting to elaborate, often tragic demonstrations of love and loyalty. Historical accounts describe knights publicly performing exaggerated feats of bravery or self-sacrifice simply to demonstrate devotion toward an unattainable beloved, often the wife of a superior or rival nobleman. Imagine yourself clad in heavy armour dramatically riding into tournaments or mock battles, purposefully enduring injury or humiliation, hoping desperately to earn distant admiration from someone else's spouse. Medieval romance had oddly masochistic tendencies, yet here's an intriguing scholarly debate. Historians vigorously argue about how widely practiced courtly love actually was among real medieval knights. Was it mostly a literary ideal, a romanticised fantasy confined to poetry and legends, or did genuine knights earnestly practice these behaviours in real life? Historians differ passionately. Some suggest real-life knights rarely pursued courtly love seriously, dismissing the tradition as poetic exaggeration. Others insist historical records hint strongly at authentic knights deeply influenced by courtly ideals, profoundly shaping their romantic relationships and marriages. Certainly medieval literary culture overflowed with courtly love narratives, poems, songs and romantic epics celebrating impossible loves, doomed affairs and tragic romantic heroes. Troubadour poetry, particularly prevalent in medieval France, popularised courtly love as a cultural ideal. Poets composed passionate verses praising noble women, expressing extravagant emotional anguish, longing and devotion. Picture yourself as a medieval noblewoman, politely listening at court while knights earnestly recite dramatic verses about your unparalleled beauty and virtues, despite being married to someone else. Flattering? Maybe. Awkward? Definitely. On the quirky fringe, medieval religious authorities occasionally criticised courtly love culture, warning knights against dangerously romantic fantasies. Clerics sometimes sternly condemned courtly love as spiritually hazardous, leading knights toward immorality, vanity, and marital infidelity. Imagine medieval monks and priests sternly wagging their fingers, cautioning impressionable young knights against romantic poems and scandalous courtly flirtations. Evidently, medieval church authorities clearly recognised courtly love's unsettling moral ambiguity. But let's briefly turn toward reality again. Historical documents describe countless medieval knights facing painfully practical marital arrangements, obliged to marry women they barely knew or actively disliked, purely for political or economic alliances. Historical chronicles describe knights grimly resigned to marriages with spouses entirely indifferent, incompatible, or even actively hostile. Medieval knights might be heroes on the battlefield, but behind closed doors, marital life could be surprisingly miserable. Quirky historical records occasionally capture knights attempting to navigate these complicated situations humorously or cleverly. Some knights actively sought lengthy military campaigns or distant crusades, conveniently avoiding difficult marriages through strategic absences. Imagine yourself as a medieval knight, gleefully volunteering for distant crusades or endless tournaments, secretly relieved at avoiding uncomfortable domestic tensions waiting at home. Medieval knights clearly demonstrated impressive creativity when handling difficult marital situations. Tonight, as you lie comfortably beneath cosy blankets, far from medieval romantic complexities, spare a sympathetic thought, or perhaps an amused smile, for medieval knights. Beneath polished armour and heroic legends lay individuals struggling deeply with conflicting loyalties, obligations and romantic ideals. Medieval marriage, as knights vividly demonstrate, often created nearly impossible emotional conflicts, trapping individuals between strategic necessity, emotional longing and social expectation. Our historical bedtime journey still holds more curious, troubling and surprising revelations ahead, so settle in, breathe deeply, and prepare yourself as we continue exploring medieval marriage's strange and unsettling landscapes. Sweet dreams, friends. But perhaps avoid dreaming too vividly about knights and romantic triangles tonight. You've been warned. If our exploration into knights and courtly love didn't already convince you that medieval marriages could be a hot mess, just wait until we unpack tonight's next bizarre and disturbingly literal medieval marital drama: bedroom battles. That's right, marital beds in medieval times weren't always cosy sanctuaries for rest and romance. In fact, they sometimes became scenes of surprisingly literal conflicts and struggles, both physical and psychological. Brace yourself, friends. This journey's getting messy again. First, picture yourself in a medieval marriage, sharing a cramped, drafty bed in a cold, stone-walled chamber. The bed, often the only place to stay truly warm, became contested territory, especially during the harsh medieval winters. You think arguing about who stole the blanket last night is bad, Imagine shivering beneath thin covers, locked in a silent but intense battle for every precious inch of blanket or space. Medieval marital beds, often narrow and uncomfortable, practically guaranteed nightly territorial conflicts. Historical records occasionally humorously document complaints and arguments over bed-sharing etiquette, blankets, or snoring. Who knew medieval chroniclers sometimes sounded eerily similar to modern-day marital therapists? But beyond humorous squabbles over bed space or covers, medieval marriages frequently faced more profound power struggles that sometimes erupted dramatically in the marital bedroom itself. Spousal authority and control stood at the heart of medieval marriage, culturally reinforced by societal norms, religious teachings, and legal expectations. Men were typically seen as household heads, expected to maintain discipline and order, sometimes using deeply uncomfortable and questionable methods. Yet medieval documents repeatedly demonstrate that marital power dynamics weren't straightforward. Medieval spouses constantly negotiated, struggled, and resisted each other's authority, occasionally erupting in open physical confrontations. Historical records include troublingly frequent accounts of marital disputes escalating into outright violence, even involving weapons or armour. Picture yourself suddenly jolted awake by shouting, pots and pans clattering, and perhaps even a sword or dagger being dramatically brandished during heated marital disputes. Medieval marital arguments sometimes resembled small battles, complete with defensive manoeuvres, shouting matches, and strategic retreats. Indeed, medieval courts occasionally dealt with extreme marital violence cases, detailing injuries sustained during household conflicts. Domestic tranquility clearly wasn't guaranteed, even behind supposedly respectable medieval household walls. Here's a quirky fringe fact highlighting medieval marital battles' occasionally absurd details. In some European regions, especially Germanic territories, unusual legal traditions allowed spouses to resolve serious disputes through judicial duels or physical contests. Yes, that's correct. Actual combat between spouses, overseen by judicial authorities. Medieval court records vividly describe these bizarrely literal marital battles, where disgruntled husbands and wives physically fought one another, sometimes armed with clubs, sticks, or heavy stones wrapped in cloth. Picture yourself nervously standing before a medieval judge, solemnly accepting judicial permission to settle marital disagreements by physically fighting your spouse. Romantic? Absolutely not. Absurdly medieval? Definitely. Intriguingly, medieval judicial marital duels featured weirdly gendered rules attempting to balance the playing field. Women, considered physically weaker, were sometimes allowed advantages, such as men fighting from waist-deep pits to restrict their movement, or women wielding specially weighted clubs. Imagine yourself standing in a muddy pit, your spouse looming above armed with heavy clubs or stones, while local villagers cheered or gasped in shock at your marital conflict publicly turning into literal combat. Historical documents record spectators eagerly attending these absurd spectacles, blending serious legal proceedings with bizarre entertainment. Clearly, medieval society had an unusual appetite for sensational marital drama, yet beneath these shocking extremes lay a serious scholarly debate. Historians vigorously discuss how representative these extreme cases were of everyday medieval marriages. Were literal marital battles or judicial duels merely sensational exceptions, dramatically recorded precisely because they were unusual? Or did they reflect widespread societal acceptance of spousal violence, oppression, and control? Scholars remain divided, combing through sparse historical records attempting to uncover genuine medieval marital dynamics, hidden beneath layers of official documentation and sensational anecdote. On a lighter, humorous note, medieval literature frequently parodied marital battles, gently mocking spouses who engaged in absurdly dramatic conflicts over trivial issues. Popular medieval songs, stories, and plays portrayed husbands and wives engaged in exaggerated domestic squabbles, wielding kitchen utensils dramatically or threatening absurd punishments for minor transgressions. Medieval humour clearly recognised and mocked the universal absurdity of marital power struggles, demonstrating a surprisingly modern comedic sensibility. Interestingly, medieval church teachings frequently intervened, attempting to mediate marital conflicts and discourage household violence. Clerics routinely advise compassion, forgiveness, and mutual respect between spouses, actively mediating disputes and counselling reconciliation. Imagine yourself as a medieval priest, patiently listening to disgruntled spouses airing grievances, sternly counselling moderation, and carefully mediating compromises. Medieval clergy clearly recognised marital conflict's severity, actively promoting peaceful household relationships wherever possible. Yet despite these interventions, medieval marriages undoubtedly experienced frequent conflicts, sometimes trivial and humorous, occasionally troublingly severe. Marital battles vividly highlight medieval relationships' complexity, filled with negotiation, conflict, power struggles, humour, and occasional absurdity. Tonight, as you lie comfortably beneath cosy blankets, hopefully not currently engaged in bitterly contested blanket territory disputes, spare a thought, or maybe a cautious laugh, for medieval couples whose bedrooms occasionally became literal battlegrounds. Medieval marriage, as we've discovered repeatedly tonight, involved complexities, struggles, and bizarre cultural traditions often glossed over in romanticised portrayals. Sweet dreams, friends, although perhaps avoid dreaming vividly about medieval marital duels or blanket battles tonight. Consider yourselves duly warned. If you think we've already seen medieval marriages at their weirdest, hold on to your pillows. Things are about to get a little more complicated. Tonight, we explore one of the trickiest medieval marital debates. Who actually controlled marriage in the Middle Ages? The church or secular authorities? Picture yourself in the centre of an intense medieval tug-of-war, pulled one way by solemn priests clutching Bibles, and the other way by stern kings or ambitious lords wielding swords and land deeds. Spoiler alert, medieval marriages weren't just awkwardly intimate. They were intensely political and religiously contested battlegrounds. At first glance, you might assume medieval marriage firmly fell under church jurisdiction. After all, marriage was considered a sacrament, meaning religious authorities naturally held significant control. Priests performed weddings, set marital rules, and adjudicated disputes. Picture yourself standing nervously before a stern medieval priest, anxiously listening as he solemnly pronounced you spiritually bound to another person forever. Church authority undeniably shaped medieval marriage's daily realities. Yet beneath this neat religious authority narrative lurked much messier political realities. Medieval rulers, nobility, and local lords also had significant stakes in marriage, especially concerning property, inheritance, alliances, and political stability. Consequently, secular authorities regularly intervened, manipulated, or outright controlled marital decisions, particularly among nobility and royalty. Imagine yourself anxiously awaiting marriage arrangements announced not by church bells or priests, but by sternly practical feudal lords, kings, or noble families. Religious ideals about consent, love, or spiritual bonds frequently took back seats to ruthless secular pragmatism. This church versus secular authority marital tension occasionally escalated dramatically. Medieval history vividly documents conflicts where kings or feudal lords clashed openly with religious authorities over marriage-related disputes. The famous historical conflict between England's King Henry VIII and the Catholic Church, leading ultimately to England's dramatic break from Rome, illustrates these explosive medieval tensions. Henry's desperate attempts to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, dramatically resisted by the Pope, vividly encapsulate medieval marriage's tangled religious and political implications. Medieval marriages were clearly far more complicated than romanticised fairy tale depictions suggest. Here's a quirky fringe fact about medieval marriage jurisdiction. In certain European regions, particularly Northern Europe, feudal lords claimed marriage rights, maritagium, allowing them significant control over their serfs' marriages. Peasants might require explicit lordly permission before marrying, often accompanied by obligatory payments or symbolic rituals emphasising lordly authority. Picture yourself nervously approaching a medieval lord, humbly requesting marriage permission, anxiously awaiting his whims, demands, or financial conditions. Romantic, right? Intriguingly, these secular marriage controls occasionally sparked intense popular resentment or resistance, with medieval peasants actively seeking church intervention or protection against oppressive lordly marriage demands. Historical chronicles vividly document peasants appealing passionately to local clergy, desperately seeking religious intervention to prevent lordly exploitation of marital rights. Imagine local priests patiently mediating tense disputes between furious lords and desperate peasants, attempting delicate compromises balancing spiritual compassion against harsh secular realities. Such complicated scenarios highlight a broader scholarly debate. Historians vigorously argue about how genuinely widespread secular lordly marital control actually was in medieval Europe. Was this practice extensively enforced, or was it primarily symbolic or theoretical, rarely exercised practically? Medieval scholars debate intensely, analysing sparse historical records attempting to uncover genuine marital realities hidden beneath complicated layers of feudal custom, church jurisdiction, and popular resistance. Church authorities themselves grappled constantly with secular challenges to their marital authority, attempting to assert control firmly through detailed canonical regulations governing marriage validity, consent, annulments, and prohibitions. Canonical laws meticulously defined acceptable marriages, prohibited unions between close relatives, consanguinity, enforced strict sexual morality, and insisted upon genuine consent. Picture medieval priests carefully consulting dense canonical law books, patiently advising anxious couples about detailed marriage rules governing permissible unions, forbidden relatives, or annulment possibilities. Medieval church authorities clearly recognised marriage's deeply contested societal nature, seeking firm religious regulation wherever possible. Yet medieval secular authorities often ignored, challenged, or manipulated these religious rules. Kings frequently petitioned religious authorities for special dispensations, allowing politically advantageous but religiously dubious marriages, including unions between distant relatives. Medieval chronicles recount kings and nobility diplomatically pressuring or negotiating intensely with religious leaders, seeking special papal permissions or dispensations relaxing strict canonical marriage rules. Imagine yourself anxiously awaiting distant news from Rome, nervously hoping special papal dispensations arrived quickly enough to legitimize politically crucial marital arrangements. On a humorous note, medieval popular culture frequently mocked these intricate church versus secular marital conflicts. Medieval satirical literature and plays humorously portrayed kings, priests, and lords endlessly bickering over marital jurisdictions, humorously highlighting the absurdity of intense conflicts arising from simple romantic unions. Medieval humour clearly recognised, and playfully mocked, marital authorities' messy political and religious contradictions. Tonight, safely distant beneath your cosy blankets from medieval marital jurisdictional conflicts, spare a thought, or perhaps an amused chuckle, for medieval couples nervously navigating complicated webs of church versus secular authorities, battling intensely over marital control. Medieval marriages involved far more than romantic declarations, awkward wedding night traditions, or bedroom territorial battles. They encapsulated complex power struggles deeply embedded within broader medieval political, religious, and social structures. Our historical bedtime journey continues forward, promising more fascinatingly uncomfortable revelations and historical complexities waiting ahead. Rest comfortably tonight, friends, but perhaps avoid dreaming too vividly about intense medieval jurisdictional battles between priests, kings, and lords over marital decisions. Medieval marriage clearly offered enough complications without that particular nightmare scenario tonight. All right, friends, we've seen medieval marriages become business deals, battlegrounds, and bizarre social spectacles. But tonight, let's delve into a particularly controversial and surprisingly complex topic: medieval divorce. Yes, despite popular notions of marriage as an unbreakable lifelong bond back then, medieval divorce actually did exist. It wasn't common, it certainly wasn't easy, but it was occasionally possible, and oh, did it create some sensationally scandalous situations. Imagine yourself trapped in a medieval marriage that's gone sour, not just mildly irritating like stolen covers, but genuinely unbearable. Maybe your spouse squandered your inheritance, committed infidelity, or even mysteriously vanished altogether, a disturbingly frequent medieval occurrence. Could you simply end things? Surprisingly, the medieval answer was a cautious sometimes. Medieval society, especially religious authorities, officially insisted upon marriage's permanence. After all, marriage was a sacred sacrament binding couples spiritually forever. Yet church courts and secular authorities frequently encountered situations clearly requiring separation or annulment. Enter medieval divorce. a legal quagmire filled with intricate theological debates, social dramas, and deeply awkward courtroom confrontations. Here's a quirky historical distinction important to understanding medieval marital separations. Official church doctrine didn't recognise divorce, in our modern sense, complete dissolution allowing remarriage. Instead, medieval church courts granted annulments, declaring marriages invalid from their inception. Imagine yourself standing nervously before medieval church judges, desperately explaining why your marriage was never valid. Perhaps you never consented properly, your spouse concealed important truths, or the marriage violated complex canonical rules about forbidden relationships. Medieval annulment proceedings involved extensive examinations, witness testimonies, and detailed canonical rule interpretations. Awkward doesn't even begin to describe these intense marital courtroom dramas. Yet, intriguingly, medieval secular courts occasionally granted limited forms of actual divorce, usually termed separations, allowing couples to live apart, but critically, rarely permitting remarriage. Secular courts particularly intervened regarding marital abuse, abandonment, or financial misconduct. Medieval court records vividly document women, and occasionally men, appealing passionately to secular authorities, seeking protection, legal separations, or property restitution. Picture medieval courtrooms packed with curious villagers, eagerly observing dramatic marital dispute proceedings, listening breathlessly as spouses aired deeply uncomfortable accusations publicly. Medieval marriage clearly involved complicated legal dramas worthy of modern courtroom reality shows. An especially famous medieval divorce case involved Eleanor of Aquitaine and her husband, King Louis VII of France. Married initially as teenagers, their relationship gradually soured, worsened dramatically by failed crusades, political disagreements, and, according to medieval gossip, Eleanor's alleged infidelities. Eventually, Eleanor successfully secured annulment on conveniently discovered canonical grounds of consanguinity, being distantly related. Picture yourself anxiously navigating delicate political negotiations, assembling canonical arguments, carefully proving your marriage invalid from the start. Eleanor skillfully navigated these awkwardly delicate medieval marital proceedings, ultimately marrying England's future King Henry II mere months later. Medieval divorce clearly involved considerable political drama. These complicated medieval annulments provoke intense scholarly debates. Historians argue passionately about how representative famous cases like Eleanor's genuinely were. Did ordinary medieval folk frequently pursue marital annulments? Or was this primarily a privilege enjoyed by nobility and royalty, whose wealth and influence allowed extensive canonical manoeuvring? Scholars differ sharply, meticulously examining medieval parish registers, court records, and canonical archives seeking clearer historical understanding. One curious fringe medieval annulment ground involved accusations of impotence. Yes, impotence. Medieval canonical law explicitly recognised impotence as valid annulment grounds, requiring awkwardly detailed evidence. Medieval court records vividly document spouses testifying explicitly about marital intimacy problems, awkwardly answering probing questions from church judges. Occasionally, marital impotence trials involved humiliatingly intrusive medical examinations. Imagine yourself nervously enduring medical scrutiny, attempting to determine your marriage's canonical validity. Romantic? Absolutely not. Cringe-inducingly awkward? Definitely. Medieval church authorities themselves debated these complicated annulment rules frequently, attempting careful balancing acts between strict canonical teachings and compassionate pastoral approaches. Clergy regularly mediated marital disputes, carefully counselling reconciliation before reluctantly considering annulments. Imagine yourself as a medieval priest, patiently listening to desperate spouses passionately describing marital misery, thoughtfully weighing canonical rules against emotional suffering. Medieval church authorities clearly recognised marriage's painful complexities, even if official doctrines emphasised permanence. Interestingly, medieval literature humorously depicted annulments occasionally. Popular medieval plays and satirical writings mockingly portrayed spouses cleverly inventing absurd annulment justifications, exaggeratedly describing fictional marital disasters, or conveniently rediscovered consanguinity rules. Medieval humour clearly recognised, and playfully mocked, complicated annulment proceedings, gently poking fun at elaborate canonical technicalities underlying genuine marital suffering. Yet despite these humorously exaggerated portrayals, medieval marital annulments undeniably involved real suffering, conflict, and social upheaval. Marital separations often triggered bitter family disputes, complicated property divisions, and social stigmas. Medieval chronicles vividly document communities anxiously observing annulment proceedings, discussing scandalous accusations breathlessly, eagerly gossiping about courtroom dramas, publicly airing intimate marital details. Imagine yourself anxiously enduring intense social scrutiny throughout complicated annulment processes. Medieval marriage clearly involved significant social risks. Tonight, safely distant beneath your cozy blankets from medieval annulment courtroom dramas, spare a sympathetic thought, or perhaps an amused chuckle, for medieval couples desperately navigating complicated canonical rules, intrusive medical examinations, and intense courtroom confrontations, seeking escape from marital misery. Medieval marriage involved far more than romantic unions, strategic alliances, or awkwardly intrusive bedding ceremonies. It encapsulated complex legal, theological, and social dramas, reflecting broader medieval societal complexities. Our historical bedtime journey still promises more fascinating revelations and historical complications awaiting ahead. Rest comfortably tonight, friends, but perhaps avoid dreaming vividly about intense medieval annulment courtroom dramas or awkward impotence examinations tonight. Consider yourselves thoroughly warned. After untangling the medieval mess of annulments and half-divorces, tonight we turn our attention to the next uncomfortable question. What happens when a medieval marriage ends not in scandal, but in death? Welcome to the strange and contradictory world of widowhood, a state that could make you wealthy, lonely, feared, admired, or occasionally accused of witchcraft, all depending on your gender, social class, and just how much power people thought you were suddenly wielding now that your inconvenient spouse had been removed by natural, or not-so-natural causes. Picture yourself as a medieval widow, wrapped in heavy black wool, walking slowly through your village while whispers trail behind you. Your neighbours might pity you, envy you, or straight-up fear you. In some cases, widowhood gave women unprecedented social freedom. Suddenly you could control your late husband's property, make independent decisions, and even, gasp, run a business. That's right. A widow could own land, sue in court, and manage estates without male supervision. For some women, widowhood was the first and only time they'd hold any real authority in their lives. But before you get too excited about your new medieval girlboss phase, let's add a dark twist. That freedom often came at a social price. A widow might be seen as dangerously independent, too powerful, too vocal, too unattached. Suspicion followed you like a shadow, especially if your husband had died under sudden or murky circumstances. People might start asking uncomfortable questions. Did she help it along? Was it really an accident with the firewood? Is she using herbs again? And just like that, you've gone from grieving wife to suspected poisoner, or worse, witch. Widowers didn't face the same uphill battle. A man who lost his wife, especially if he had young children or land to manage, was expected to remarry quickly. Like really quickly. There are records of noblemen remarrying within weeks, sometimes days, of their wives' funerals, as if they'd penciled in grief for the weekend and scheduled a wedding for Monday. For men, widowhood was a temporary inconvenience. For women, it was a complicated new social identity, one that came with both power and peril. And now for a quirky fringe fact. In some medieval towns, there were actual designated mourning periods, not just emotionally, but fashionably. Widows were required to wear specific types of clothing, usually dark, heavy, and deeply unflattering, for a set amount of time to prove their grief. Think of it as enforced sadness couture. In some regions, widows had to wear mourning garb for a full year. Not exactly subtle. It's like walking around with a giant sign that reads, "Yes, I know he's dead, please stop asking." Widowhood also carried significant economic implications. If you were a noblewoman, the property you brought into the marriage, your dowry, could revert to you or be claimed by your husband's family, depending on local customs and how tightly your late spouse had managed to hang on to the paperwork. In some cases, widows ended up in court fighting to reclaim what was theirs. Imagine standing before a grim-faced judge trying to argue that the 10 acres your husband borrowed from your dowry to buy pigs should now be returned to you in full, preferably without the pigs. These legal wranglings could stretch on for years, leaving women financially stranded and socially vulnerable. Of course, not all widows were independent or left with land. For many women, especially peasants or city dwellers without wealth, losing a husband meant financial ruin. Without a man's income or social protection, these women were sometimes forced into begging, labour or joining religious communities. Convents offered a kind of refuge, a life of piety and prayer, yes, but also food, shelter, and a community of fellow women who, for whatever reason, had also stepped outside traditional marital paths. Yet some widows leveraged their status brilliantly. A few even gained reputations as powerful landowners or formidable businesswomen. In medieval London, for instance, widows often continued running their husbands' shops, sometimes even expanding them. Guild records show widows maintaining workshops, employing apprentices, and representing their trades publicly. For women savvy enough to navigate the social tightrope, widowhood could become a platform, not just for survival but for influence. This leads us to a lively scholarly debate. Was widowhood in the Middle Ages more liberating than oppressive for women? Some historians argue that widowhood offered women rare autonomy, financial, legal and social, especially in urban centres. Others caution that the risks of social isolation, property loss, and suspicion too often outweighed those gains. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Widowhood was what you made of it, provided you didn't mind walking a tightrope over a pit of legal wrangling, moral judgment and whispered rumours. Now, just to ensure your bedtime story includes at least one plot twist, let's touch on the idea of merry widows, women who embraced their new freedom a bit too enthusiastically in the eyes of their communities. These were the women who dressed too brightly too soon, who laughed too loudly at taverns, or who, scandalously, refused to remarry at all. In many folk tales and sermons, the merry widow becomes a cautionary figure, tempting upright men with her independence and wild ways. The message was clear: grief is expected, and joy is suspicious, at least when it's coming from a woman alone. So tonight, as you curl into your bed, grateful for your right to live independently without being suspected of poisoning anyone, spare a moment for the medieval widow. She lived in the shadowy in-between, part respected, part feared, sometimes powerful, sometimes powerless. And whether she ended up a nun, a shopkeeper, or the subject of gossip by candlelight, she was one of the rare figures in medieval society who could, just maybe, rewrite her own story. We've met runaway brides, miserable knights, courtroom drama queens, and grieving widows, but now it's time to meet the ultimate rule-benders, the royals. Welcome to the world of medieval polygamy, or at least the incredibly creative ways kings and nobles managed to keep multiple romantic partnerships going without technically breaking the rules. Because when you're a monarch with enough land, money, and divine authority to bend time and space, who needs just one spouse? Let's get something clear right away. The medieval Catholic Church had very strong feelings about marriage, specifically that you should only be in one at a time. Officially, polygamy, the practice of having more than one wife at once, was forbidden. But forbidden and enforced were two very different things in medieval Europe, especially when it came to kings. These guys didn't exactly line up to confess every misstep. Instead, they found clever loopholes, wrote the rules to suit themselves, or, in some cases, just ignored them entirely while their priests politely looked the other way. Take King Philip II of France, for instance. Now here's a man who really gave the church a headache. He married Ingeborg of Denmark, then promptly decided he didn't like her. Within months he tried to ditch her and marry someone else. The Pope said no. Philip did it anyway. For over 2 decades he refused to recognise Ingeborg, while living openly with another woman and having children with her. The church fumed, the Pope threatened excommunication, and Philip just sort of shrugged and carried on. It was medieval marriage law via Catch Me If You Can. And then there was Emperor Charlemagne. Yes, that Charlemagne. The golden boy of the early Middle Ages. He had at least 5 official wives and a dozen concubines, all while enjoying the church's blessing. Why? Because he was Charlemagne, and everyone was just so excited about his whole reviving the Roman Empire project that they kind of forgot to count how many wives he was collecting. It's good to be the emperor. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some medieval kings went so far as to stage unofficial marriage-like ceremonies with mistresses. These were not legally binding, but they gave the appearance of legitimacy. and more importantly gave heirs a veneer of respectability. Think of it as medieval PR management. If you can't get the Pope to approve your second marriage, maybe you can just throw a really convincing party, get a bishop who's looking the other way and call it close enough. Royal mistresses themselves became powerful figures in court. Far from being hidden away in shame, many were given estates, titles, and political influence. In France, women like Agnes Sorel and Diane de Poitiers weren't just lovers, they were cultural and diplomatic forces in their own right. Agnes even lived openly in the royal court and had a hand in advising King Charles VII. Imagine being so good at being the other woman that you end up running parts of the government. Still, all this rule bending came with the risks. The church could, and sometimes did, strike back. Excommunications were not just spiritual timeouts, they could plunge entire kingdoms into political chaos. Kings who defied marriage laws might find their legitimacy questioned, rebellions stirred, or alliances fractured. When King Lothair II of Lotharingia tried to divorce his wife Theutberga and marry his mistress Waldrada, the church blocked him at every turn. Despite years of court proceedings, alliances and ecclesiastical drama, the marriage was never annulled, and Lothair died with neither a legal wife nor a legitimate heir. It's basically the medieval version of dying in a custody battle you started. There's a scholarly debate here that keeps medievalists busy. Were these royal rule breakers exceptions to the rule, or were they revealing just how malleable the institution of marriage really was at the top? Some argue that royal polygamy, whether open or symbolic, exposed the practical limits of church authority. Others believe these cases simply show how kings abused their power, bending sacred institutions for personal gain while everyone else played by the rules, or tried to. In any case, the gap between official doctrine and royal behaviour was wide enough to drive a gilded carriage through. And speaking of bending doctrine, let's not forget the convenient use of annulment. Kings who wanted a new wife often discovered that their first marriage had been invalid all along. Maybe they were too closely related. Maybe they didn't really consent. Maybe the stars weren't aligned correctly. Whatever the excuse, it was often enough for a king to wiggle out of a marriage and take a new bride, especially if the Pope could be persuaded with the right combination of gold, troops, or political leverage. Meanwhile, your average medieval villager couldn't even look at another potential partner without risking accusations of adultery, fines, or public humiliation. But the king? He was on wife number 3, mistress number 5, and still hosting extravagant feasts where both were seated within arm's reach. Tonight, as you lay comfortably beneath your sheets, hopefully beside someone you actually chose and only one of them, spare a curious thought for the medieval monarchs who rewrote the rules of matrimony to fit their crowns. For them, marriage was a tool, a weapon, a negotiation, and occasionally an inconvenience to be annulled, ignored, or repackaged with a fancy title and a kiss on the cheek. Because if there's one thing the royal bedchamber teaches us, it's this. When power meets desire in the Middle Ages, the church can preach all it wants. But kings, well, they tend to get what they want anyway. At this point in our strange and winding tale, you may have thought we'd already covered the weirdest possible outcomes of medieval marriage. But oh no. Buckle up, because tonight we're diving straight into one of the most jaw-dropping traditions to ever spring from the chaotic union of love, law, and violence. Trial by combat, marital edition. Yes, in some parts of medieval Europe, if a husband and wife had a serious dispute, they could literally fight it out. And not just in the metaphorical sense. We're talking about sanctioned, staged, referee-supervised physical combat. Spouses in full-on battle mode, swinging clubs and flinging accusations. I mean, forget couples therapy. This was Mortal Kombat, medieval style. Now, before we go any further, let's get one thing straight. This wasn't happening in every village or every marriage. But in parts of medieval Germany and surrounding territories, during the 13th to 15th centuries, a very real legal procedure existed that allowed men and women to settle certain domestic grievances through sanctioned physical duels. Trial by combat had long been a staple of medieval justice. If two parties disagreed over something serious and there were no clear witnesses, they could fight it out in a judicial duel, under the idea that God would grant victory to the party in the right. But somehow, someone along the way thought, you know who else should be able to do this? Married couples. And so, in rare but astonishing cases, husbands and wives would take to the ring, sometimes literally, a ring of rope or fencing, with crowds watching, judges observing, and rules in place to ensure that the combat was fair, sort of. Here's how it worked. Since men were generally stronger, they were handicapped. A husband might be placed in a pit up to his waist, with one arm tied behind his back. The wife, meanwhile, was allowed to move freely and often armed with a weighted cloth, stone-filled sack, or sometimes a club. It's exactly as ridiculous and dangerous as it sounds. Imagine a man in a muddy hole trying to swing a stick with one hand while his wife dances around the perimeter, whacking him with a beanbag full of rocks. It's like something out of a violent medieval game show, and somehow it was supposed to decide serious legal matters, like accusations of adultery, attempted murder, or gross misconduct in the marriage. A famous case recorded in a 13th century German legal manual describes a duel between a man accused by his wife of attempted murder. The woman won by bludgeoning her husband unconscious. He was later executed. Whether you find that disturbing, impressive, or both probably depends on how many episodes of true crime podcasts you've binged this week. Here's your quirky fringe fact for the evening. In some trial by combat illustrations preserved in manuscripts, you can see spectators, neighbours, clergy, even children, sitting around watching these duels unfold like it's just another Sunday. People brought snacks. No, seriously, these weren't private, shame-filled affairs. These were public events, and sometimes wildly popular. Come for the sermon, stay for the spousal slugfest seems to have been the unspoken motto. Of course, not every disagreement between spouses ended in a duel. These were extreme cases, invoked when both parties refused to confess, compromise, or submit to ecclesiastical mediation. More commonly, marital disputes were handled through community intervention, church council, or, especially in wealthier households, lengthy legal disputes full of passive-aggressive parchment and icy stares. But trial by combat existed, and its very existence says a lot about how medieval people understood marriage, and that brings us to a hotly debated scholarly question. Were these combats really about justice, or were they about control? Some historians argue that allowing women to fight their husbands, even under skewed terms, reflected surprising legal recognition of women's agency. Others suggest these were spectacles more than solutions, public humiliations meant to reassert male authority or entertain the masses. And let's be honest, it's not a great look for your legal system when your idea of marital arbitration involves a bloodied sack and a mud pit. What's also interesting is how gender expectations flipped, at least for a moment during these fights. While men were restricted and disadvantaged, women were given temporary power, enough to land a few good hits. But this was not a long-term empowerment narrative. The woman's moment in the spotlight was fleeting and highly conditional. After the duel, win or lose, social norms resumed their familiar shape, often snapping back harder. A woman who won might find herself respected, or feared. A woman who lost might face exile, punishment, or public shame. And if it sounds like a no-win situation, that's because it often was. You might be wondering, did trial by combat between spouses happen outside of Germany? Not really, at least not with any regularity. In England and France, trial by combat was more limited, and while there are stories of marital duels, they tend to be literary or allegorical rather than literal, which might be for the best. It's hard to imagine the English peasantry getting too excited about rolling around in pits or swinging stone bags at each other while the town crier placed bets. Still, trial by combat between spouses lives on in popular imagination, particularly through illustrations in medieval manuscripts and retellings by horrified or amused historians. These images are surprisingly detailed, sometimes comic, sometimes grim, and they serve as stark reminders that the line between justice and performance in the Middle Ages was, let's say, a little blurry. So tonight, as you lie comfortably under a blanket and not inside a waist-deep hole holding a club, spare a moment of disbelief for the couples who settled their marital problems by bashing each other in front of the neighbours. Marriage, in the medieval world, was sometimes more cage match than contract, more battlefield than bed of roses, and if nothing else, be thankful your next disagreement won't require a referee, a public arena, and a sack full of rocks. Unless you're into that, in which case, carry on, but maybe don't invite the bishop. By now you might be wondering if anyone in the Middle Ages actually married for something as quaint and fragile as love. After all the duels, dowries, and dramatic escapes, it's easy to assume that romance had no real place in medieval marriage. But here's where things get even more complicated, because the idea of marrying for love didn't just exist back then, It terrified people. That's right. In a world where marriage was a practical tool for preserving wealth, forging alliances and producing heirs, the idea of two people choosing each other based on affection, absolutely scandalous. Dangerous even. Love was fine in poetry, song, and whispered flirtations behind castle columns. But as the foundation for a legal binding union, that was playing with fire. Imagine you're a medieval noble, carefully orchestrating your child's marriage to secure a peace treaty or increase your family's land holdings. Now imagine that child falls in love with someone outside your plan, someone poor, scandalous, or simply inconvenient. Suddenly your hard-earned political gains are on the brink of collapse because your son has a thing for a travelling lute player, or your daughter is sneaking off to meet the blacksmith's apprentice behind the stables. See the problem? Marrying for love challenged everything the medieval establishment believed about social order. It threatened the rigid class system, undermined parental authority, and made a complete mess of inheritance law. And yet the idea refused to go away. In fact, it started to creep in more and more during the High Middle Ages, slipping through the cracks of court culture and literary fantasy. This is the era when romantic love stories began to flourish. Poetry, plays, and tales where lovers risked everything to be together. Think Tristan and Isolde, Abelard and Eloise, or basically half the Arthurian legends. These weren't sweet bedtime stories. They were tragic, forbidden, and sometimes scandalously sexy. Here's the strange part. While the church frowned on these stories for glorifying passion and disobedience, they still spread like wildfire. The rise of courtly love, a stylized form of idealized, often extramarital romance, dominated the literature of the 12th and 13th centuries. In these tales, love wasn't a peaceful domestic feeling. It was agony, obsession, and spiritual longing. Lovers pined, suffered, and sometimes died because they couldn't be together. Romantic love in these stories was a noble torment, a test of character rather than a reason to marry. And yet, even as these tragic romances captivated audiences, they reinforced the idea that true love and marriage didn't mix. Courtly love was usually adulterous, symbolic, or impossible. That was kind of the point. It existed in opposition to the mundane, arranged, and often disappointing reality of marriage. You could write poetry about your soul's longing for a fair maiden, but you were still expected to marry the baron's daughter because she came with 300 sheep and a vineyard. Still, the tension between love and duty caused plenty of real-life drama. There are historical accounts of nobles, and even royalty, defying their families and social rank to marry someone they actually loved. These cases usually ended badly. Families disowned rebellious lovers, governments revoked titles, and the couple might find themselves exiled, impoverished, or dragged into years of legal battles. That didn't stop them from trying, though. Love, apparently, is not easily discouraged, even by property law and angry uncles with crossbows. Here's a quirky fringe fact. Some medieval advice manuals warned specifically against marrying for love. A 12th century cleric named Andreas Capellanus, who wrote The Art of Courtly Love, cautioned that true passion burned too hot to be sustained in marriage. Love was for inspiration and poetry. Marriage was for order, children, and contracts. Basically, if you were in love with someone, that was probably a good reason not to marry them. Advice like this makes modern dating apps look almost reasonable by comparison. And that brings us to a recurring scholarly debate. When did people start marrying for love? Some argue it wasn't until the late Middle Ages that affection began to play a more significant role in marital choice, particularly among the rising merchant class. Others insist love always existed in marriage, just not in the way we romanticize today. Instead of starting with love, couples might grow into it over time, an idea that still floats around in arranged marriage cultures today. But whatever side you're on, there's no denying that the medieval ideal was usually duty first, emotions a distant second. But love did sneak into some marriages, often in quiet and unrecorded ways. Letters between husbands and wives reveal moments of affection, tenderness, even desire. Some couples clearly enjoyed each other's company. Some grieved deeply when their partner died. These glimpses remind us that despite all the structures and pressures around them, medieval people were still human. They wanted to be understood, to be seen, to be cared for, not just married off like prize livestock. Still, you couldn't go around saying that out loud. Marrying for love was considered impulsive, dangerous, and irresponsible. For much of the Middle Ages, It meant choosing your heart over your heritage, and that kind of thing rarely earned you a happy ending. So tonight, as you lie peacefully in your bed, next to someone you hopefully chose yourself, or maybe no one at all, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Love isn't always easy today, but at least you don't have to sneak around castle walls or argue with your bishop about whether your heart is leading you straight to damnation. In the Middle Ages, love could be revolutionary, and more often than not it was punished for daring to exist. So next time you sigh over a rom-com, remember, your ancestors might have literally gone to war for that kiss in the rain. Now that we've peeked into the tragic and scandalous world of love and longing, let's swing the door wide open on something even more inflammatory: unfaithfulness. If marrying for love was dangerous, stepping outside your marriage for a little forbidden fun, that was practically an act of war. Welcome to the world of adultery in the Middle Ages, where the stakes were sky high, the punishments were brutal, and public humiliation was often the cherry on top. Let's get this out of the way first. People in the Middle Ages cheated. Of course they did. They were humans, not marble statues carved into cathedral walls. Monogamy might have been the ideal preached from pulpits and scrawled across law scrolls, but real-life marriage was full of frustrations, emotional distance, mismatched expectations, and, let's be honest, a total lack of modern deodorant. It's no wonder that some people looked elsewhere. What makes medieval adultery particularly fascinating, though, isn't that it happened, it's how it was treated. Spoiler, gently is not the word you're looking for. In most medieval societies, adultery was a serious offence, not just morally but legally. And guess what? It mattered a lot more if you were a woman. While men might get a slap on the wrist, or just a knowing wink, women caught cheating often faced brutal repercussions. Depending on where you lived and how angry your husband or your in-laws were, you could be fined, flogged, imprisoned, exiled, or worse. Picture this. A woman accused of adultery is paraded through her village wearing nothing but a shift, her hair shorn, sometimes even with signs hung around her neck announcing her sin. Townspeople gathered to watch the spectacle, throwing rotten food, shouting insults, or worse. Public shaming wasn't just about punishment, it was about erasing the woman's social standing, reducing her to a cautionary tale. In some areas, she might be locked in the stocks, or subjected to a humiliating ritual bath, scrubbed clean of her shame in front of a jeering crowd. Romance, medieval style. Men accused of adultery faced far fewer consequences unless they were caught with someone else's wife. And even then, it was the husband's honour that had been violated, not necessarily the moral code. One of the stranger legal customs of the time was the concept of criminal conversation, a man's right to sue another man for seducing his wife. Not because the wife had her own agency or suffered harm, he had damaged property. Cheating wasn't seen as a betrayal between equals, but a theft of a man's control over his household. Of course, things were a little different in noble and royal circles. Adultery there could trigger wars, political intrigue, or dynastic collapse. Just ask Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's ill-fated second wife, who was accused, possibly falsely, of adultery with multiple men. Her supposed betrayal didn't just cost her her marriage, it cost her her head. Accusations of adultery in royal courts were often less about love and lust, and more about political manoeuvring. But that didn't make them any less deadly. Here's a quirky fringe fact. Some medieval towns maintained adultery benches or shame stools in public squares. Fancy decorated chairs where those accused of infidelity were forced to sit while the entire town gawked. And if you were particularly unlucky, someone might commission a song or poem about your misdeeds. Because nothing says personal privacy like a lute-playing bard crooning about your affair while your neighbours pass bread and point fingers. There were a few ways out of this mess, though. If a couple both agreed to reconcile, the church might let it go, especially if the offending spouse confessed and did penance. That often involved fasting, wearing plain clothing, making donations to the church, or going on pilgrimage. Basically the medieval version of saying, I've made mistakes, and I'm working on myself. The more public the scandal, the more dramatic the penance. And yet, for all this moral outrage, adultery still happened. Constantly. Court records are full of cases involving love triangles, secret trysts, and scandalous affairs. Some even read like romance novels. A woman sneaks away under cover of darkness. A man is discovered climbing through a bedroom window. A couple is caught in the act in a barn or a forest clearing. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of the rhythm of medieval life, even if everyone pretended otherwise. Naturally, this leads us to the ever-lively scholarly debate. Were medieval people more sexually repressed, or just better at pretending? Some historians argue that the Middle Ages were soaked in guilt, shame, and rigid religious expectations, making even innocent flirtation feel dangerous. Others suggest that beneath the surface, people were far more permissive, and that the harsh punishments existed precisely because society was trying to control something it couldn't quite suppress. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, a society obsessed with order and control, wrestling with the messy reality of human desire. Interestingly, the Church had a complicated relationship with adultery. It condemned it, of course, but it also forgave it, repeatedly. Priests heard confessions, assigned penance, and moved on. It was seen as a sin, yes, but not an unforgivable one, at least in theory. In practice, how much you paid for it often depended on who you were, how many people knew, and whether your scandal inconvenienced the wrong person. So tonight, as you lie beside your loyal partner, your cat, or your trusty body pillow, take a moment to be grateful that your worst romantic mistakes aren't punishable by rotten vegetables or being serenaded about your sins in the town square. Adultery in the Middle Ages wasn't just a private heartbreak, it was a public spectacle, a legal affair, and sometimes a death sentence. Whether born from boredom, passion, rebellion, or revenge, infidelity was treated as both a sin and a social crisis, an echo of how fragile and high-stakes medieval marriage really was. In that world, one stolen kiss could ruin a life, or at the very least, land you a front-row seat on the shame stool. By now it probably won't surprise you to hear that medieval marriage wasn't just a minefield of social obligations and romantic disasters, it was also a goldmine for opportunists, fraudsters, and con artists. That's right. Tonight, we explore the underworld of medieval matrimony, the cheats, liars, bigamists, and smooth-talking swindlers who turned marriage into a personal hustle. If love was hard to find, truth was even harder, and sometimes the biggest threat to your happily ever after wasn't a feuding family or a disapproving priest, but a spouse with a suspiciously murky past and one too many wedding rings. Let's start with one of the oldest tricks in the medieval book, bigamy. In a time when communication was slow, travel was difficult, and record-keeping was patchy at best, some folks decided to play the odds. Picture this. You marry in one town, then disappear a few months later, show up in a different town miles away, and do it all over again. New clothes, new name, new spouse. It wasn't exactly common, but it happened often enough to raise concerns, and church courts dealt with more than a few cases of someone suddenly discovering that their darling husband was already someone else's darling 3 villages over. The church treated bigamy seriously, very seriously. Once marriage was declared a sacrament, having more than one at a time was considered not just deceitful but downright heretical. If you were caught, you could be excommunicated, fined, imprisoned, or, in more severe cases, branded. Yes, actually branded, as in having a hot iron pressed to your skin to mark you as a marital criminal. Nothing says, "Don't date this guy," like a permanent scar declaring his relationship history. But the risk didn't stop everyone, especially men who moved around for work. Soldiers, travelling merchants, or wandering artisans found bigamy to be a disturbingly convenient way to secure shelter, support, and sex without sticking around long enough for the truth to catch up. And then there were the fake marriages. This grift usually worked like this. A man, though sometimes a woman, would promise marriage, perhaps even perform a fake ceremony, collect a dowry or generous engagement gift, and then vanish into the night. These weren't just isolated acts of heartbreak, they were targeted cons. A particularly infamous case involved a man who moved from town to town pretending to be a minor noble, proposing to merchants' daughters, charming their families, and then disappearing with gold, clothing, and sometimes livestock before anyone figured out they'd been played. Basically, the medieval Tinder swindler, minus the private jets and with more hay carts. Here's your quirky fringe fact of the night. Some fraudsters went full performance. There are actual reports of fake priests being hired or impersonated to conduct sham weddings, complete with forged documents, borrowed vestments, and very convincing Latin mumbling. Imagine the betrayal of thinking you've just married someone in a candlelit ceremony, only to discover later that Father Benedict was actually Steve from the tavern in a borrowed cassock. Not exactly the story you want told at family gatherings. Women too could be marriage fraudsters, though it was riskier and rarer. Some posed as widows of wealthy men to secure sympathy, housing, or protection. Others exaggerated their dowries or lied about their family's social standing to snag a higher status husband. In one case from the 14th century, a woman passed herself off as the daughter of a minor nobleman and managed to marry a wealthy merchant. The truth came out after someone recognised her from a nearby village, where she was very much not a noble's daughter, but a butcher's niece. The marriage, unsurprisingly, was annulled, and she was publicly humiliated. But for a brief moment, she lived like a lady. These scams thrived because medieval marriage, despite its seriousness, had some logistical loopholes. Records weren't always centralised. Proof of identity could be faked or assumed. And in an age where many people never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace, showing up in a new town with a good story and a confident smile could get you surprisingly far. Of course, not every marriage fraud involved fake priests or secret spouses. Some were more subtle and more tragic. People lied about their financial status, their health, their fertility. A man might claim to be wealthy, only for his new bride to discover his debt-ridden household after the ceremony. A woman might hide the fact that she'd been previously married or even had children. These weren't crimes in the same way, but they were still deceptions that eroded the already shaky trust at the foundation of many medieval marriages. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how common this kind of marital fraud really was. Some historians argue that the colourful cases found in court records are the exceptions, the scandalous outliers that got written down precisely because they were so outrageous. Others argue that the frequency of fraud reflects deeper anxieties in medieval society about trust, identity, and the vulnerability of marital arrangements. Either way, it's clear that marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just emotionally risky, it was financially and socially dangerous too. And here's the real kicker. If you were a victim of marital fraud, your options were limited. Sure, you could take your case to court, plead your story to a local bishop or magistrate, maybe even get your marriage annulled, but doing so often meant airing your most personal misfortunes in public. Court records are full of humiliating depositions, desperate letters, and painfully detailed accounts of deception and heartbreak. The process was slow, expensive, and often rigged in favour of those with power or better social connections. So tonight, as you lie safely in your own bed, take a moment to appreciate the wonders of personal ID, online background checks, and civil marriage licenses. In the Middle Ages, choosing the wrong partner didn't just mean heartbreak. It could mean scandal, exile, or years of humiliating legal drama. And as for those travelling nobles with suspiciously vague stories, charming smiles, and eagerness to marry, maybe don't let them meet your daughter. Just saying. If you thought being scammed by a bigamist was bad, imagine being in love with someone who your entire society has declared off limits. Tonight, we're entering the forbidden zone of interfaith and interclass marriages, those rare but scandalous unions that dared to cross the medieval world's rigid social and religious boundaries. These weren't just personal choices, they were lightning rods for controversy, suspicion, and in many cases, violence. Marrying the wrong person wasn't just a family scandal. It could make you a pariah, a target, or, depending on your location and the century, a heretic. Let's start with interfaith marriages, which in medieval Europe almost always meant a Christian marrying a Jew or a Muslim. These unions were rare and heavily frowned upon by both religious communities. Christian leaders, especially after the First Crusade, were increasingly obsessed with purity, conversion, and drawing hard lines between faith groups. Marrying someone of a different religion wasn't seen as a romantic gesture. It was viewed as betrayal, a threat to the soul, a corruption of the bloodline. And let's be honest, it didn't go over too well at family dinners either. If you were a Christian woman marrying a Jewish man, or even rumoured to be, you could expect more than gossip. In many regions, local authorities or church officials would launch investigations. Accusations of conversion might follow, or worse, accusations of sexual coercion. In some cases, mobs attacked or murdered couples suspected of improper relationships. Marrying across religious lines wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. These relationships happened, of course, usually in secret, but surviving them required incredible courage, or a whole lot of luck. The most well-known examples of interfaith marriages come from frontier regions, places like Spain during the Reconquista, where Christians, Muslims and Jews often lived side by side in uneasy proximity. Here, cultural intermingling made these marriages more common, but also more politically explosive. One case from 14th century Spain involved a Muslim noblewoman who converted to Christianity and married a Christian knight. Local rulers were outraged, and the marriage triggered diplomatic protests, social unrest, and endless debate over whether love or politics had motivated the union. Even with powerful protectors, the couple spent their lives walking a tightrope of suspicion. And then there's the other half of this coin, interclass marriages. On paper, there was nothing explicitly illegal about marrying someone from a lower class, but socially, it was practically treason. A nobleman marrying a peasant? Scandalous. A wealthy merchant marrying a servant? Girl? Cue the family outrage. Medieval society was stratified so deeply that crossing class lines in marriage was seen as upsetting the natural order, an affront to both God and economics. If you were a noble, your marriage wasn't just about your personal life. It was a matter of family strategy, political allegiance, and inheritance rights. Marrying below your station could mean losing land, titles, or access to courtly circles. For noble women especially, marrying a man of lower status could lead to outright disinheritance. Imagine a baroness eloping with the blacksmith's son, only to be cut off from her family, forced to live in a modest cottage, and scorned by former friends who now wouldn't even let her in the cathedral pews. Love had consequences, and yet these marriages happened. Sometimes out of love, sometimes out of desperation, sometimes as the result of seduction, deception, or pregnancy. Local records reveal fascinating tales of knights marrying milkmaids, lords running off with innkeepers' daughters, and even clergy abandoning their vows to start new lives with women of much humbler status. These weren't fairy tales. Most ended badly, shunned, poor, and powerless, but not all. A few managed to carve out quiet lives in exile, away from the structures that had once confined them. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In some cities, particularly in Italy and southern France, wealthy merchants created a kind of unofficial nobility through marriage. By marrying their daughters to landless but titled nobles, they could buy their way into higher social circles while rescuing crumbling aristocratic bloodlines. This led to a weird fusion of old titles and new money, which everybody grumbled about but quietly accepted because, well, money talks, especially when your family castle needs a new roof. Of course, not everyone had to marry someone wildly outside their class or religion to cause a scandal. Sometimes just marrying the wrong kind of person within your social circle was enough to spark chaos. A widowed merchant marrying his young apprentice. Scandalous. A noble marrying a second cousin too close for comfort. Legally questionable and ecclesiastically dicey. These marriages didn't always break the law, but they definitely broke the unspoken rules that governed medieval society like iron bars wrapped in velvet. So, what happened if you broke those rules? It depended on where you were and how much power your family had. Some couples were exiled, some had their marriages annulled, some simply vanished into the margins of history, buried under shame and silence. And in a few rare cases they became legends. Stories passed down through hushed whispers or scandalized songs, living on long after their rebellious hearts stopped beating. There's a rich scholarly debate about how common these forbidden marriages really were. Some argue that they were rare exceptions, romanticized or sensationalized by storytellers and historians alike. Others suggest they were far more common than we think, especially in cities and border regions where cultural lines blurred and enforcement was weak. The truth is, we'll probably never know exactly how many people risk everything for love across lines of faith or class. What we do know is that the very fact these unions were dangerous made them powerful, symbols of rebellion, courage, or, depending on your viewpoint, scandal. Tonight, as you tuck yourself into your blanket and enjoy the freedom to fall for whoever your heart chooses, regardless of faith, class, or social expectation, spare a thought for the brave, or reckless, medieval couples who dared to love where they weren't supposed to. Their marriages weren't always happy, or even long, but they were undeniably human. And in a world built on rigid rules and inherited cages, that kind of love was nothing short of revolutionary. Let's step out of castles, courtrooms, and scandalous town squares for a moment, and into the place where marriage in the Middle Ages actually happened day in and day out. The home. That's right. Tonight we're heading into the domestic sphere, the not-so-glamorous side of medieval matrimony. Because while royal weddings and forbidden romances grabbed the headlines, most medieval marriages were lived out under leaky roofs, beside smoky hearths, and in work-worn hands. It wasn't about jewels or dowries, it was about survival, and a whole lot of chores. So picture yourself waking up on a straw mattress in a 2-room cottage. You and your spouse are already late. There's grain to mill, goats to feed, and if you're lucky, maybe a piece of stale bread to split before you get to it. Marriage in medieval Europe, especially for the lower classes, wasn't romantic. It was economic, practical, and above all functional. Spouses weren't so much partners in life as co-managers of a tiny under-resourced survival enterprise. For most couples, the division of labour wasn't just tradition, it was necessity. Women typically handled the inside work: cooking, weaving, tending the hearth, raising children, spinning wool, and managing the household supplies. Men worked the land, tended to livestock, and handled labour outside the home. But these roles weren't rigid. In times of hardship, or, let's be honest, just whenever the need arose, both spouses crossed lines. If a man fell ill, his wife ploughed the fields. If a woman died in childbirth, her husband had to keep the household running somehow. There were no days off, no room for weakness. You didn't marry for passion, you married for backup. Here's a fringe fact for your collection. In many households, husbands and wives slept in the same room as their children, their animals, and occasionally their in-laws. Privacy. What privacy? The idea of a marriage bed as a sacred romantic space, not in a 1-room house shared with 2 goats, a grandmother, and a 6-year-old who kicks in his sleep. It wasn't uncommon for an entire household to sleep on the floor together, or in one large bed if they were lucky enough to own one. That definitely adds a new layer of meaning to Till Death Do Us Part. And speaking of layers, let's talk about cleanliness, or rather, the lack thereof. Hygiene was a challenge, to say the least. Bathing was infrequent, water was often shared and cold, and fabrics weren't exactly soft. You and your spouse probably smelled like wood smoke, livestock, and salted fish most of the time. This wasn't anyone's idea of a scented candle romance. Intimacy in marriage had to work around the realities of daily filth, exhaustion, and zero personal space. If someone in that household had enough energy for flirting after 12 hours of labour, they were practically a superhero. Of course, in wealthier homes, the domestic routine looked different, but not necessarily easier. Noble women often ran massive households with dozens of servants, estates to manage, and the constant pressure of performing their social role flawlessly. Marriage among the nobility was still a job, just with different costumes. A lady might spend her days managing inventory, overseeing kitchens and laundry, arranging feasts and accounting for the estate's production. If her husband was away, as many were for war or business, she might essentially run the whole estate. Romantic, right? There's a rich scholarly debate about how affectionate or cooperative these marriages were. Some historians argue that medieval couples, especially peasants, probably developed strong bonds through shared hardship and interdependence. You ploughed the same fields, raised the same kids, buried the same parents. How could you not form a partnership? Others emphasise that marriage was still fundamentally unequal, especially for women who bore the burdens of childbirth, domestic labour, and social expectations without much say in how their lives unfolded. The truth is likely both. Some couples became genuine partners in life. Others simply endured each other, side by side, until one of them dropped dead from exhaustion, plague, or a farming accident. Interestingly, household records, especially in towns, show a surprising amount of cooperation. In artisan families, husbands and wives often worked together in the same trade. Baking, blacksmithing, weaving, brewing. Wives didn't just support their husbands, they worked beside them, managed sales, kept the books, and trained apprentices. In some cities, a widow could even inherit her husband's business and become the legal head of a household enterprise. For women with skills and savvy, marriage wasn't just a role, it was an opportunity, especially in urban centres. That said, domestic violence was a harsh and present reality for many women. Legal texts permitted correction of a wife by her husband under certain vague conditions, and enforcement was wildly inconsistent. Some communities intervened when men became dangerously abusive. Others turned a blind eye, considering it a private matter. The line between discipline and cruelty was often blurred, and women had few legal options for protection. Records show that while extreme abuse could lead to separation or community intervention, everyday violence was tragically normalised. Still, people found joy where they could. Medieval songs, jokes and stories tell of couples bickering playfully, laughing together, sharing stolen kisses behind market stalls. Life was hard, yes, but humour and affection still found a way in. A wife might make fun of her husband's thinning hair, a husband might joke about his wife's obsession with hoarding scraps of cloth. These moments, small, human, ridiculous, paint a more complete picture of medieval married life than any court record ever could. So tonight, as you curl up in your quiet, private, goat-free bedroom, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of running water, temperature control and marital disagreements that don't involve arguments over who forgot to feed the chickens. Medieval domestic life wasn't glamorous, but it was real, raw, necessary, and in its own strange way, deeply human. Marriage in the Middle Ages was less about romance and more about resilience, less about feelings and more about functioning. But through the dust, the cold, the noise and the grind, some people managed to carve out companionship. And maybe, just maybe, that's its own kind of love story. If you've made it this far through the dimly lit hallways of medieval matrimony, you've probably figured out that few people entered marriage with anything resembling a proper understanding of what it involved, especially when it came to what happened after the bedding ceremony, and not just in terms of who was hogging the blanket. Tonight, we're opening the creaky door to one of the most awkward, often absurd corners of medieval life, medieval sex education, or more accurately, the gaping void where sex education should have been. Let's be real. Sex in the Middle Ages was both everywhere and nowhere. It was written about in courtly poetry, joked about in taverns, condemned from pulpits, and occasionally immortalised in deeply questionable artwork on church pews. If you know, you know. But when it came to actually educating people about the mechanics of sex within marriage, how to do it, how often, why it mattered, and when to stop, medieval culture took a giant step back and muttered something about modesty and mystery. For most people, what little knowledge they had came from folklore, gossip, and some very vague advice from older relatives or neighbours, who themselves had only a half-baked understanding. If you were lucky, your mother might pull you aside the day before your wedding and mumble something like, "Just lie still, and it will be over soon." Not exactly the empowering pep talk you'd hoped for. Meanwhile, grooms were often left to figure it out, sometimes guided by nothing more than rumour and the ribald jokes of their drinking buddies. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. The church, unsurprisingly, had a lot to say about when you could have sex, but very little on how. It taught that sex was sacred, sure, but also a little gross, something best done quickly, quietly, and only for procreation. Enjoyment, highly suspicious, variety, even more so. There were actual church documents, serious theological writings that discussed which sexual positions were acceptable and which ones might lead to eternal damnation. Spoiler, missionary was fine, everything else was not. Medieval priests occasionally warned couples that if they strayed into passionate or creative territory, they might invite demons into their bed. Nothing kills the mood faster than a mental image of Satan critiquing your technique. One quirky fringe fact. In some rural areas, newlyweds were given advice by village wise women or midwives, who, despite their unofficial status, offered far more practical and compassionate guidance than the church ever did. These women might whisper herbal remedies for discomfort, fertility tips, or old superstitions like sleeping with rosemary under the bed to ensure a male heir. Some even provided basic anatomical sketches, not always accurate, but better than nothing. Of course, this kind of folk knowledge existed in tension with religious doctrine, and the line between helpful midwife and suspicious witch was razor thin. Meanwhile, in noble households, education about sex came wrapped in layers of metaphor, literature, and discreet nudges. Aristocratic boys might be handed a romance poem or a Roman classic filled with suggestive lines. Girls might be told that obedience and quiet suffering were the cornerstones of marital duty. There were no birds and bees talks, just symbolic gestures, veiled comments, and a strong suggestion that if you just obeyed God and your husband, everything would somehow work out. Unfortunately, that wasn't always the case, and let's not forget how little medieval people understood about reproductive health. Most believed that conception required not just intercourse, but mutual pleasure, so if a woman got pregnant, it was assumed she had enjoyed the act. This twisted bit of pseudoscience was used to argue, horrifyingly, that rape victims couldn't become pregnant, because if they had, it must not have been real rape. This dangerous and deeply flawed idea persisted for centuries and had devastating consequences for women who were victims of sexual violence. As for contraception, the church outright forbade it, of course, but that didn't stop people from trying. Historical records mention all kinds of creative, often terrifying methods: herbal pessaries, amulets, bizarre diets, even magical spells. Effectiveness was questionable. But it shows that medieval people weren't just blindly obeying religious teachings. They were trying, with whatever tools they had, to exert control over their reproductive lives, which is kind of incredible considering how much misinformation they were working with.
Medieval scholars today debate just how clueless people really were. Some argue that while formal education was lacking, practical knowledge, especially among women, was much higher than we tend to assume. Midwives, mothers, and older women passed down knowledge orally, creating informal networks of sexual education that defied the silence of the church. Others suggest that because so much of this knowledge was never written down, we risk romanticizing it. The truth, as always, is probably in the murky middle. Still, the broader message was clear. Sex was dangerous if not contained, and the best way to contain it was through marriage. That meant a lot of people went into marriage with huge expectations, little understanding, and often a deep sense of guilt or fear. It's no wonder that marital intimacy could become a source of confusion, frustration, or even shame. In some cases, couples went months, or longer, without consummating their marriage simply because neither one knew exactly how. And guess who showed up to fix it? Priests. That's right. Historical records show that clergy were sometimes called in to explain the basics, or even to observe and confirm that a marriage had been properly completed. The horror, the sheer, unrelenting horror. So tonight, as you rest comfortably in a world with books, the internet, and absolutely zero need to invite your parish priest into your bedroom, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. Medieval marriage was built on silence, shame, and superstition, and yet, people somehow made it work? Sort of. In a time when you were expected to produce heirs without understanding how babies were made, when intimacy was considered suspicious, and when sex could literally be a sin depending on the day of the week, medieval couples stumbled into the most personal parts of their marriages with almost no guidance. And if that doesn't make you appreciate modern sex ed, even the awkward health class version, I don't know what will. If you're still awake after that deep dive into medieval awkwardness, don't get too comfortable just yet. We're about to step off the edge of reason and straight into the strange realm of medieval love potions, charms, and magical misadventures. Because when clear communication and basic biology failed, as they so often did, some desperate souls turned to the next best thing: magic. Yes, tonight we explore the secret world of enchanted herbs, whispered spells, and the very real fear that your marriage, or lack of one, might be hanging on the contents of a suspiciously sweet-smelling drink. Let's set the stage. You're a young peasant girl. You've got a crush on the handsome baker's son, but your father wants you to marry the pig farmer next door. The baker's boy barely notices you. What do? Well, in some medieval villages, the answer was clear. Find the local wise woman, pay her in bread or coins or eggs, and ask for a love charm. Maybe a potion to make him fall head over heels, or a charm to tie his affections to you forever. Harmless? Maybe. Risky? Absolutely. Love magic was both widespread and wildly controversial. From simple amulets and love knots to more dubious recipes involving hair clippings, menstrual blood, or graveyard dirt. Yes, really. Medieval people were surprisingly creative in their pursuit of affection. Some believed in writing a lover's name on parchment and hiding it under the bed. Others swore by specific herbs, like basil, rue, or yarrow, believed to attract affection or stir desire. If it grew in the garden, someone, somewhere, had probably tried boiling it into a drinkable romance elixir. The church, of course, hated all of this. Love magic was lumped in with witchcraft, heresy, and demonic influence. To use a love potion was to tamper with divine will, to try to override God's plan for your romantic life. And worse, it blurred the already fragile lines between consent and coercion. If someone fell in love with you after drinking your suspicious tea, was it genuine affection or magical manipulation? The theological implications were murky, and the legal consequences could be severe. Inquisitors and local clergy took love magic seriously. Records from the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the late medieval guide to rooting out witches, specifically mention love spells as
a sign of dangerous sorcery. Women accused of using them could be fined, imprisoned, or in more extreme cases, executed. And because women were most often associated with these magical practices, whether as practitioners or victims, they bore the brunt of the suspicion. A woman whose husband suddenly became distant. Maybe he'd been enchanted by a rival. A man who left his wife for someone younger. Clearly she'd bewitched him. Forget emotional immaturity or midlife crises. This was a world where magic could be blamed for heartbreak. But love magic wasn't just the domain of the poor or desperate. Even nobles, especially women, were known to dabble in it. Some historical accounts mention queens and ladies of the court, commissioning astrologers and alchemists to create powders or potions to keep their husbands faithful, or encourage affection from a politically advantageous suitor. One infamous case from the 14th century Italy involved a noblewoman accused of seducing multiple men using enchanted wine. Whether she was guilty or just a clever manipulator is still debated, but she was eventually tried and imprisoned. Her case sparked a panic in noble circles and triggered an uncomfortable round of marital paranoia. If your husband suddenly brought home flowers, did he really love you, or had someone slipped something into his goblet at the feast? Here's a quirky fringe fact. Some love spells doubled as curses. If the person you desired rejected you, you could simply tweak the incantation, same herbs, different words, and wish them ill fortune in love forever. Bitter much? You bet. Medieval revenge was nothing if not petty and poetic. But not all magical marriage efforts were sinister. Some were downright wholesome, or at least well-intentioned. Communities had traditions meant to ensure marital harmony, like placing rosemary under the marriage bed, tying red ribbons around the doorposts, or reciting blessings over newlyweds with symbolic gestures to bind them together. Were these technically spells? Depends on who you ask. For a village priest, they were harmless folk traditions. For an inquisitor, they could be signs of dangerous paganism. Context, as always, was everything. Historians debate how widespread love magic really was. Was it common practice, or just an idea that terrified clerics more than it affected daily life? Some scholars believe that love spells were more symbolic than practical, a way to express longing or hope in a world with few options for romantic agency. Others argue that the frequent appearance of magical complaints in court and church records proves they were taken seriously, feared by communities, and used more often than we might like to think. And let's not forget the psychological element. In an age of limited medical understanding, unreliable personal freedoms, and no legitimate ways to change your marital fate, magic represented control. If your heart was broken or your spouse was cruel, a charm gave you a sense of power. Maybe it didn't change the outcome, but it gave you a way to act when you otherwise had none. Of course, the irony is that love magic was often blamed when things didn't go right. If a marriage collapsed, if a groom lost interest, if a bride miscarried, suspicion turned quickly towards supernatural interference. Even successful marriages could be marred by gossip. She must have enchanted him, people might whisper. There's no way he'd choose her otherwise. In some towns, that was all it took to get summoned before an ecclesiastical court and questioned about your candle collection. So tonight, as you sip your completely non-magical chamomile tea and drift towards sleep, take a moment to marvel at the strange lengths people once went to for love, or something like it. Love potions, charms, whispered wishes over herbal brews. They may not have worked, but they spoke volumes about the deep longing for connection, control and closeness in a world that often denied all three. In medieval marriage, where so much was predetermined and rigid, magic was a flickering candle in the dark. Dangerous, yes, but also full of hope and desperation, and maybe a dash of cinnamon. By this point in our medieval marriage misadventure, you might be wondering, was anyone immune to this chaos? Surely the church itself, the holy institution orchestrating all these marital rules and rituals, upheld them in its own house, right? Well, prepare for a fresh dose of disillusionment, because tonight we're cracking open one of the juiciest, most controversial chapters of all. The forbidden love lives of priests and nuns. Yes, even the clergy weren't immune to passion, temptation, and the occasional extremely awkward secret wedding. Let's start with the basics. In theory, by the time the 12th century rolled around, the church had pretty firmly established clerical celibacy. That meant priests, monks, bishops, and basically anyone in holy orders were forbidden from marrying, or technically even thinking too hard about the concept. The idea was that clergy should be spiritually focused, unburdened by the messy distractions of family life. Marriage required earthly attachments, and the church wanted its shepherds to be unattached and fully committed to God. But in practice, let's just say the line between sacred duty and secular desire was a bit blurrier than official doctrine liked to admit. Plenty of priests, especially in rural parishes, had what polite society called housekeepers, women who lived with them, cooked for them, cleaned for them, and not infrequently had children with them. These women were sometimes referred to as concubinae in official records, which is Latin for, we all know what's going on here, we're just not going to talk about it. Some of these relationships lasted decades. Some priests even referred to their partners as my wife, despite no legal marriage. These arrangements were unofficial, scandalous, and, somewhat incredibly, often tolerated by local communities. After all, it's hard to complain about a priest's moral failings when he's also the one delivering your last rites. And then there were the nuns. These women took vows of chastity, yes, but they were still very much human, and often cloistered with minimal supervision. Many entered convents as children, usually to fulfill family expectations or because they lacked a marriageable dowry. Their understanding of sexuality, relationships, or even what marriage entailed could be painfully limited. Yet despite the rigid expectations, or maybe because of them, stories of illicit relationships between nuns and priests, or sometimes other nuns, abounded in both reality and legend. Historical records are full of breathless reports. Secret rendezvous in cloisters, forbidden letters passed through convent windows, and the occasional scandal involving a pregnant nun. One particularly infamous case in 14th century France involved an entire convent implicated in a series of affairs with local clerics, resulting in multiple excommunications, a fire, and what must have been the most uncomfortable sermon in town history, whether love, coercion, or sheer loneliness motivated these liaisons. The church treated them with official horror and private resignation. Punishments varied wildly, from reassignment to public penance to being quietly sent to a distant monastery, where the scandal could be buried, literally and figuratively. Here's your fringe fact of the evening. Despite the official ban on marriage, there were periods when clerical marriage was technically allowed. Early in the medieval period, many priests were married, particularly in the Eastern Christian world and in remote Western regions where enforcement was spotty. The major crackdown came with the Gregorian reform movement in the 11th century, which insisted that priests must be celibate and broke up existing marriages by force. That's right. Priests who had already been married, some with children, were suddenly told to abandon their families. Many resisted. Others complied in a grim display of institutional loyalty. Imagine being a medieval wife whose marriage was retroactively deemed invalid because your husband got promoted at church. So why the obsession with celibacy? The scholarly debate rages on. Some argue that it was about moral purity and spiritual focus. Others point to economics. Without wives or children, priests couldn't pass on church lands or inherit wealth, which conveniently kept everything in the church's hands. The practical benefits of enforced celibacy are hard to ignore when you follow the money. And yet, the rule remained deeply controversial. Even high-ranking bishops and cardinals were known to keep long-term mistresses or quietly support their children through donations to local churches or charities. Pope Alexander VI, before becoming pope, fathered several children with his mistress and even threw lavish parties in her honour. He wasn't exactly the only one. The line between sacred and scandalous was, at times, barely visible. Ironically, the Church's own rules sometimes created the very problems it feared. By banning legal marriage, it forced relationships underground, where they were harder to monitor, control, or address. What could have been honest unions became whispered scandals, breeding shame and hypocrisy rather than true holiness. It's the classic story. When you make something forbidden, you don't eliminate desire. You just teach people to lie about it. And let's not overlook the women caught in the middle. For nuns, any sexual misconduct, whether consensual or coerced, meant spiritual ruin, social ruin, and often permanent exile from their community. For the priests involved, the consequences could be severe but were often less lasting. The double standard was as medieval as the pews themselves. Of course, not all clerical relationships were secretive or salacious. Some were genuinely affectionate partnerships, born from long hours of shared labour and mutual respect. But without the legal framework of marriage, these bonds were vulnerable, easily denied, punished, or erased. A priest's partner had no legal rights, no social recognition, and often no protection. They were unseen, even when their presence was obvious. So tonight, as you lie peacefully in your bed, without worrying that your relationship will get you excommunicated, take a moment to consider the quiet heartbreak and resilience of those who dared to love within a system that demanded silence. The Church may have declared marriage sacred, but it struggled to allow its own members to fully experience that sacrament, and in doing so, it turned love into a secret, something whispered in candlelight or hidden behind stone walls. For the priests and nuns who crossed that line, marriage wasn't just forbidden, it was revolutionary, risky, human. We've tiptoed through forbidden love, duels, dowries, and enough ecclesiastical drama to fill a cathedral. But let's not forget the people who made all this matchmaking madness possible. Tonight, we enter the curious world of medieval matchmakers and marriage brokers, the social engineers of the age, quietly, or not so quietly, steering the course of countless lives. Because before dating apps, before awkward dances and dinner parties, before the crushing existential dread of "it's complicated," there were the busybodies with parchment, personal networks, and a sharp eye for social advantage. In the Middle Ages, you didn't just find a spouse, you were found one. Families, especially among the wealthier classes, treated marriage like a chess game, and matchmakers were the strategists. Their job? To arrange a union that benefited everyone involved, except possibly the people getting married. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of LinkedIn, eHarmony, and your nosy aunt all rolled into one, except they came armed with family trees, reputation rankings, and a deep knowledge of who had money, land, heirs, or an unfortunate tendency to die young. In Jewish and Islamic communities, matchmaking was a well-respected profession. Jewish shachanim, matchmakers, played an essential role in arranging marriages, especially in diaspora communities where keeping ties strong and kosher was crucial. They weren't just hired to set people up. They offered wisdom, mediation, and a weirdly accurate ability to sense whether two teenagers who'd never spoken would manage to run a household together. The shachan would negotiate dowries, ensure both families were suitable matches, and sometimes even offered gentle counselling. In return, they'd receive a fee, modest but important, and the satisfaction of knowing they'd made a socially approved match. Islamic societies also use go-betweens known as khitbah, usually older women, who facilitated communication between families and helped navigate the delicate pre-marriage negotiations. These matchmakers were often respected figures in their communities, known for their discretion, memory, and ability to read the room, even when the room was separated by curtains and strict gender rules. Christian Europe, on the other hand, took a more informal approach. In noble families, parents, uncles, and even feudal lords took on the matchmaking role, sometimes with the help of clerics or advisors. In merchant and peasant communities, neighbours or guild members might offer suggestions, and while there were no formal matchmakers, with business cards and office hours, the function was the same. Someone nudged, pressured, or outright arranged the match, preferably with everyone sober enough to remember who owed whom what by the end of it. Here's your fringe fact for the evening. Medieval horoscope compatibility was a thing. Astrologers were sometimes consulted to determine whether two people's stars aligned favourably for marriage. If your planetary chart predicted doom and disaster, well, maybe you should marry someone else, or at least schedule the wedding during a more astrologically pleasing moon phase. Because when you're basing your future on dowries, crop yield and inherited syphilis, you may as well throw the stars into the mix. Not all matchmaking was above board though. In some regions, especially during times of famine, war or social upheaval, unscrupulous brokers preyed on desperate families. There are records of matchmakers arranging marriages for orphans, sometimes children as young as 8 or 9, purely for profit. Some forged documents to fake noble lineage, or lied about dowry terms, setting up unions doomed from the start. Imagine a couple discovering after the wedding that the promised vineyard doesn't exist, or that the bride is already secretly betrothed elsewhere. Medieval marriage fraud didn't always happen between the bride and groom. It sometimes began with the people who introduced them. And let's not forget the matchmakers who simply got it wrong. Court records occasionally mention matches that turned ugly fast, like the case of a merchant's daughter married to a local blacksmith, only for the groom to flee the village a week later with all the wedding gifts. Or the noble family that arranged a marriage between their son and a distant relative, only to realise too late that the consanguinity laws made it technically incest. Oops. This brings us to a lively scholarly debate. Was matchmaking primarily a tool of oppression, boxing people into roles they couldn't escape, or was it a form of social glue, helping families build alliances and preserve security in a chaotic world? Some historians argue that matchmaking, especially when done responsibly, created more stability than individual choice ever could in a society where survival often depended on strong networks. Others see it as just another way people, especially women, were denied agency in the most personal parts of their lives. The truth, as always, is more complicated. For some, matchmaking brought companionship, security, even affection. For others, it locked them into lifetimes of misery based on someone else's calculation. But the matchmakers themselves, they were the quiet power brokers, the shadowy architects behind countless unions, both blessed and cursed. Their work often went unnoticed, unless something went wrong. If a marriage failed, or the dowry was unpaid, or the groom ran off to become a monk, fingers were quickly pointed. The matchmaker was blamed, scorned, sometimes even dragged to court. In one case from 15th century Germany, a widow who had arranged a disastrous marriage was forced to pay restitution to both families. Her reputation never recovered, so yes, being a medieval matchmaker could be a dangerous profession. Half respected, half resented, always in someone's crosshairs. But even so, the job endured. Because when people want love, or at least a functioning household, they'll always seek someone to guide them toward it. Even if that guidance comes with hidden motives, questionable math, and a suspiciously vague description of the groom's dental hygiene. So tonight, as you relax in a world where you can swipe left without sparking a feud between entire villages, take a moment to reflect on the matchmakers of old. They weren't always right, and they weren't always fair, but for better or worse they shaped the destinies of countless people with nothing more than a quiet word, a candlelit conversation, and a well-timed suggestion that maybe, just maybe, you and that miller's son should meet. We've talked about awkward wedding nights, enchanted wine, runaway spouses, and ecclesiastical nosebleeds, but nothing, and I mean nothing, rocked the foundation of marriage in the Middle Ages quite like the Black Death. Tonight we're diving into the plague-scarred years of the 14th century, when marriage customs were pushed, broken, and occasionally abandoned entirely, all in the face of catastrophic mortality. Because when half the population of Europe is coughing up blood and collapsing in the streets, you stop worrying about dowries and start worrying about who's still breathing. So let's set the scene. It's the late 1340s. The Black Death is sweeping through Europe like a horror film in fast forward. Cities are emptying, families are being wiped out overnight, graveyards are full, people are panicking, and in the middle of all this, marriage doesn't stop. In fact, for some people it accelerates. Why? Well, when death is practically breathing down your neck, it turns out a lot of folks suddenly remember their unfinished business. That includes, of course, tying the knot, sometimes with whoever happens to be standing nearby. There are records of people getting married while sick, hoping the sacrament would purify their souls before dying. Others rushed to wed because they believed dying single meant dying in sin. And some, more practically, just wanted to make sure property or guardianship of children was sorted before everything went full apocalypse. These weren't grand romantic gestures. These were desperate, hasty, sometimes tear-soaked affairs. weddings that felt more like confessions than celebrations. And yet, amid all this despair, there were also bizarre glimmers of opportunity. With so many people dying, land, wealth, and marriageable partners suddenly shifted hands in massive waves. Widows and widowers were everywhere, and surprisingly in demand. In normal times, being a widow, especially a woman, might put you in a vulnerable position. But in plague years, a widow with property, health, and a pulse was practically a hot commodity. Some remarried within weeks, others played the field. There are records of women with multiple marriage offers, all from men hoping to secure an inheritance, or just some emotional stability, while the world burned down around them. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some regions got so overwhelmed with people rushing to marry that local bishops began issuing blanket marriage licenses. No waiting periods, no bans, no lengthy approvals. Just say the words, sign the paper, and try not to die before the ceremony ends. Love in the time of bubonic panic was nothing if not efficient. But not everyone embraced the rush to wed. In many communities, the plague caused a temporary collapse of social norms. People stopped marrying altogether, out of fear, grief, or simple logistical chaos. Clergy were dying as fast as laypeople, which meant no one was around to perform the ceremonies. Churches were locked. Priests were too sick or too scared. In some cases, couples simply declared themselves married, relying on what canon law called verba de presenti, a mutual spoken vow that, in theory, was enough to constitute a marriage. In a sense, the Church reluctantly acknowledged that extraordinary times called for extraordinary shortcuts. And then there were the long-term effects. After the plague passed, after the fields were overgrown, the homes were emptied, and the bells stopped tolling, Europe emerged into a weird, shaken new normal. Marriage customs didn't snap back to what they were before. For one thing, the massive population loss changed the economics of marriage entirely. With fewer people, labour was more valuable, and suddenly peasants and artisans had leverage. Dowries shrank, women had more negotiating power. Families who had once brokered marriages like treaties found themselves asking rather than commanding. Social mobility crept in through the cracks of the plague pit. There's a lively scholarly debate about whether the Black Death helped destabilise the rigid marriage system of the Middle Ages. Some historians argue that it gave women, especially widows, more agency, more room to choose, remarry, or remain single. Others suggest that while certain freedoms emerged, the long-term trauma of the plague reinforced the same old structures, just with new faces. What's clear is that something shifted. People started thinking differently about life, death, and what it meant to spend your time on Earth bound to another human being. And let's not ignore the spiritual side. The plague brought with it waves of religious paranoia and guilt. Some believed the disease was God's punishment for sin, including sexual sins, broken vows, and impure marriages. Flagellant processions, the original medieval flash mobs, swept through towns, with participants whipping themselves and preaching against moral corruption. Marriage, once seen as a stabilising force, was now under scrutiny. Were bad marriages part of what brought the plague? Were people living in sin? Was God angry because too many young couples were ignoring parental consent and running off to elope in barns? Naturally, the Church seized the moment to double down on doctrine. They re-emphasised the sacred nature of marriage, reasserted control over who could marry whom and how, and tried to put a theological lid on the emotional anarchy the plague had unleashed. But the damage was done. You can't unlive the horror of digging your own cousin's grave one week and marrying their widow the next. So tonight, as you enjoy the luxury of not living in a time when marriages are interrupted by plague carts and death rattles, give a little nod to the couples who tried, against all odds, to make love work in the bleakest possible hour. Their weddings may have been rushed, their motives messy, but they were human beings trying to carve something meaningful from chaos. And in that, they remind us that even in the darkest moments, people reach out to one another, sometimes for comfort, sometimes for survival, and occasionally for something that looks a lot like love. So here we are, the final act in our sprawling, uncomfortable, occasionally hilarious tour through medieval matrimony. We've wandered through dowries and duels, peasant cottages and royal courts, love potions and plague pits. And now, before we dim the candle for the night, let's step back and ask, what did all this madness actually leave behind? because as much as we'd love to keep medieval marriage in its weird, musty, goat-scented past, the truth is, parts of it still linger, in wedding traditions, in language, in the unspoken expectations that quietly hover around the idea of marriage even today. It turns out the Middle Ages aren't as dead as we'd like to think. Let's begin with something simple: the white dress. You've probably heard this before, but it's worth repeating. Medieval brides didn't wear white. That trend didn't hit mainstream until Queen Victoria made it fashionable in the 19th century. In the Middle Ages, brides just wore their best clothes, often in bold colours like red, gold or blue. But what they did wear, especially among the wealthy, were layers upon layers of fabric that screamed status. Silk, fur, gold thread, and whatever imported textile made the family look like it didn't keep livestock in the pantry. Yet somehow, the idea that a bride should present herself as pure, untouched, and glowing. That starts creeping in centuries earlier, tangled in church rhetoric and feudal ideas of virginity as property. You can thank that charming legacy for the white lace obsession and the weird cultural anxiety about saving yourself for marriage that still hasn't completely disappeared. And how about the wedding ceremony itself? Rings, vows, veils. Yep, a lot of it traces back to medieval customs, even if the meanings have been edited for modern sensibilities. The phrase, "with this ring, I thee wed," has roots in medieval church rituals. The veil, originally meant to symbolise modesty and purity, but also, more ominously, to remind everyone that the bride was being transferred, literally veiled like a sacred object, as part of a legal transaction. So romantic. The idea of the father giving away the bride, straight from the property transfer playbook. In medieval times, this wasn't a sweet emotional moment, it was business. The bride was handed over like land or livestock, and yet the tradition lives on, now softened into a moment of tender symbolism, but still echoing that old idea of women as family assets rather than free agents. A lot of wedding traditions, when you really dig into them, are dressed-up versions of contracts, safeguards, and status displays. Even the legal framework of marriage today bears medieval fingerprints. Canon law, the system developed by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, heavily influenced the Western idea that marriage is both a spiritual sacrament and a legal contract. That's why weddings often require both a church and a courthouse, because we're still trying to juggle that weird medieval dual identity of marriage, holy and bureaucratic, divine and taxable. Here's your final fringe fact. The phrase common law marriage comes, in part, from medieval understandings of marriage by consent. Remember verba de praesenti, that idea that two people could declare themselves married without witnesses, priests, or paperwork? Well, it caused so much chaos over the centuries that later legal systems had to create ways to distinguish between real marriages, secret marriages, and those awkward, we were kind of married, I guess, situations. Centuries later, we still wrestle with that blurry line between formal commitment and informal cohabitation, proof that medieval marital confusion never really went out of style. And let's not forget the most haunting echo of all, the social pressure. The idea that marriage is the default destination, that everyone should get married eventually, that your worth is somehow tied to whether you've partnered up in a legally sanctioned, culturally approved way. That's a holdover too. In medieval Europe, unmarried adults, especially women, were treated with suspicion. They were seen as unfinished, possibly immoral, potentially disruptive to the social order. And while we've come a long way since then, the ghost of that pressure still lingers, whispering from magazine headlines and family gatherings and wedding invitation lists. Of course, not everything we've inherited is grim. Some medieval couples, against the odds, did find love. They raised families. They laughed together in candlelit kitchens. They shared the burdens of an unpredictable world. Their stories remind us that even in the midst of rigid roles and religious panic, human connection still mattered. That somewhere beneath all the ceremony. And strategy, people still longed for partnership, for kindness, for someone to split the stale bread with at the end of a hard day. There's still scholarly debate over whether we romanticize or demonize medieval marriage too much. Was it truly a miserable institution for most people? Or are we imposing our modern expectations on a past that simply played by different rules? Maybe it's both. Maybe medieval marriage wasn't better or worse, just weirder, messier, a system full of contradictions, sacred and scandalous, practical and passionate, rigid yet full of loopholes. So tonight, as you sink into your pillow and hear the faint buzz of your quiet, modern life, free from plague carts, dowry disputes, and compulsory witnesses on your wedding night, take a deep breath. You're not livestock. You're not a pawn in a land dispute. You didn't have to marry your second cousin to avoid ecclesiastical exile. You're living in a world where marriage can mean whatever you and your partner want it to mean, or nothing at all. But if someone does offer you a mysterious love potion made with basil and goat's hair, maybe skip that one. Hey, if you're still here, wrapped in your blanket, half listening while your eyes go heavy, first of all, good job. You've just survived the emotional, spiritual, and occasionally fungal labyrinth of medieval marriage. That's 25,000 plus words of dowries, jewels, drippy ceilings, suspicious love potions, and holy men breaking their own celibacy vows. You've earned this quiet moment. So let's slow things down. Let your mind drift away from stone chapels and thatched roof cottages. Step out of the candlelit chaos. The ghosts of those forgotten brides and grumbling husbands can stay behind. You're not in a drafty cottage where the goats sleep next to the bed. You're here, now, in your own time, your own space, where love isn't property and you don't have to marry someone just because your uncle has a land deal in the works. It's kind of comforting, isn't it? Sure, the modern world has its issues, plenty of them, but we're no longer bound by the same chains. Marriage isn't a business contract, unless you're both really into prenups. Love isn't assigned by family council, and if your in-laws don't like your partner, well, no one's getting disinherited from a crumbling stone manor. In some ways, marriage today is still haunted by those medieval ideas. The traditions, the pressure, the absurd rituals we keep repeating without always knowing why, but at least now we can laugh about them, question them, rewrite them, or walk away from them entirely. So as you drift towards sleep, carry this thought with you. Marriage, then and now, is just a reflection of the world that builds it, and the more we understand the strange, twisted ways it's been shaped, the more power we have to shape it ourselves.